There was a time when the outline of a human life was defined by the movement of herds and the seasons, when people lived in small bands that knew the terrain intimately and carried their household on their backs. That world of hunters and gatherers stretched back tens of thousands of years, across ice and steppe, forest and coast, and it is from this mobile, attentive existence that the first seeds of settled life began to appear. The story I will tell moves deliberately, tracing how the fragile decisions of those early people accumulated across generations into something new and surprising. Listen as we step from the shadow of caves into the light of fields and villages, following the slow, stubborn work of change. The long Paleolithic era sculpted human bodies and brains, honing hunting strategies, social cooperation, and the rhythms of tool-making. People learned to track, to read the weather from the color of the sky and the behavior of animals, and to shape stone into points and blades with astonishing skill. They carried memory in their bones and songs, passing knowledge of landscapes, plants, and animal behavior from one season to the next. This practical expertise became the foundation upon which domestication and settlement would later be built. As the last ice age waned, great changes in climate rearranged habitats and pushed populations into new opportunities and constraints. Glaciers retreating northward opened corridors and revealed soils that could support more predictable plant growth, while rising sea levels erased coastlines that had once offered rich marine resources. Those changes did not happen overnight, but over centuries and millennia the balance of food availability shifted, rewarding groups that could adapt their foraging to more localized resources. Such environmental pressure was a primer for experimentation, encouraging people to pay closer attention to plant life and the cycles of reproduction that would one day be harnessed in a very different way. In places where plants and animals were abundant and dependable, people began to spend longer periods in particular places, returning year after year to rich patches of land. Archaeologists call some of those groups complex hunter-gatherers, and their settlements show signs of regular reoccupation, storage facilities, and social differentiation. The Natufian culture of the Levant, for example, built semi-permanent stone houses and stored wild cereals long before true farming took hold. This stretching of seasonal return into something like permanence is one of the first visible steps toward a settled life. The transition from strictly mobile bands to settled villages was not a single event but a mosaic of local developments happening at different paces across the globe. In the Fertile Crescent, in the river valleys of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, in parts of New Guinea, and along the coasts of Peru, people found ways to intensify the resources around them. Some regions leapt toward cultivation sooner because the local ecology provided easy yield from small interventions, such as encouraging stands of wild wheat to grow closer to human habitation. In other places the shift was slower, with people blending cultivation, husbandry, and foraging into varied subsistence strategies that could sustain larger populations. One of the most famous early shifts towards settled life occurred in the Near East, where wild grasses such as einkorn and emmer wheat and barley were abundant and easily encouraged. Over generations, people began to harvest selectively, to save seeds from the best plants, and, crucially, to sow those seeds near their dwellings. This emergent practice created feedback loops. As people protected and encouraged certain plants, those plants adapted to human conditions, becoming less wild and more useful. The process of selection was gradual and often unintentional, but its cumulative effect was enormous, producing the dependable harvests that sustained larger, year-round communities. Simultaneously, the domestication of animals like sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle provided complementary sources of protein, milk, and labor. Herding allowed people to store calories in living animals and to move nutrients across landscapes, and it encouraged new forms of territoriality and social organization. Herd animals often required different patterns of movement and care, and managing them led to innovations in fencing, corralling, and later in harnessing animals for plowing. These developments were not uniform. In some places, herds played a central role, while in others they remained peripheral to plant cultivation. Settlements blossomed along rivers and fertile plains because water and soil made predictable yields possible, but settlement was also a social invention. Even when food was no longer scarce in every season, living together in denser groups required new ways of coordinating labor, resolving conflict, and sharing resources. Households became nodes of production, with craftwork like pottery, weaving, and toolmaking often centered in the domestic sphere. The edges of villages grew into marketplaces where surplus goods could circulate, knowledge could spread, and specialized crafts could flourish. Storage, both a practical and symbolic technology, transformed how people thought about scarcity and future planning. Clay bins, pits, and granaries allowed communities to smooth out lean seasons and to store seed for planting, enabling more complex social contracts across time. With storage came accounting. Ancient people developed simple systems to keep track of who contributed what and who was owed. Those early record-keeping practices were the ancestors of writing, born from the need to manage surplus and obligation rather than from the desire to tell myths. The first true villages often show a mixture of private space and communal structures, with houses clustering around public courtyards, shared walls, or ritual places. Some sites from the Neolithic show remarkable uniformity in house size and layout, suggesting an egalitarian ethos, while others reveal clear differences in wealth and access to special goods. In some settlements, large communal constructions suggest centralized planning and shared labor, hinting at emerging leadership roles. These patterns demonstrate that settled life produced a spectrum of social forms, from relatively equal towns to nascent chiefdoms. Across the Fertile Crescent, a sequence of cultural phases led toward urban life. The pre-pottery Neolithic communities paved the way with domestication and settled villages, then later ceramic-using cultures added new technologies, and eventually the Ubaid culture set the stage for the first cities. In southern Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris braided into marshes and channels, irrigation began to change the relationship between people and soil. Water control meant that yields could be amplified, but it also required collective coordination on an unprecedented scale. Canals had to be built, sluices maintained, and water distributed fairly. The nascent importance of coordinated irrigation may partly explain why power coalesced in some communities. Canal labor required organization, and the ability to direct and sustain large workforces created strong incentives for hierarchical structures. Temples or shrine complexes often became centers for administering water and redistributing grain, tying religious authority to practical governance. This intertwining of ritual and bureaucracy hardened into institutions that shaped political power for centuries to come. From those institutional seeds grew the cities of Sumer, the southernmost cradle of Mesopotamian civilization. In dramatic places like Uruk, people consolidated into dense settlements whose monumental architecture announced a new human scale. There, platforms and step temples called ziggurats rose above streets lined with houses and workshops, and the temple precincts managed enormous quantities of grain, livestock, and artisanry. The city became a living organism, a place where roles multiplied and where specialized professions, potters, scribes, metalworkers, could support one another. This specialization was enabled by surplus, but it also fed a cultural flowering. With more people freed from subsistence labor, art, literature, and complex religious thought expanded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a richly woven narrative exploring friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning, emerged from this milieu and later resonated across generations. Literate elites used writing for varied purposes: administrative lists and receipts, legal documents, hymns, and stories that shaped communal memory and identity. Writing itself was born in administrative need and developed in surprising directions. Clay tokens and sealed envelopes evolved into abstract signs pressed onto wet clay tablets, a script known as cuneiform. What began as pictographs for counting and recording eventually became phonetic signs that could represent language in more subtle ways. The ability to record laws, contracts, and genealogies transformed the scope of governance and allowed rulers to assert continuity through written records. Urbanization brought with it the increased complexity of law and governance. Early codes and royal proclamations attempted to stabilize social relationships and expectations, putting punishments and privileges into a shared framework. While famous later codes like Hammurabi's give a public face to law, even earlier city administrations in Sumer produced legal instruments to govern trade, property, and family matters. These legal frameworks helped maintain order in burgeoning cities where anonymity and dense populations might otherwise breed conflict. The concentration of wealth in cities created distinct social strata, and elites often used conspicuous architecture and ritual to legitimize their position. Palaces, tombs, and temples articulated hierarchy through scale and ornament, while elaborate burial practices signaled status and beliefs about the afterlife. Yet the lives of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, laborers, were the backbone of these societies, and their daily efforts filled the granaries and staffed the workshops that sustained urban centers. Technology advanced rapidly where resources and human capital intersected. Metallurgy transitioned from the use of native copper to alloying with tin to produce bronze, creating harder tools and weapons that altered economies and battlefields. The wheel revolutionized transport and pottery making alike, with wheeled vehicles enabling longer distance trade and wheels used on potters' wheels producing more uniform ceramics. The harnessing of wind and water, in sails and later in simple water-driven devices, also boosted the capacity to move goods and to mechanize certain tasks. Long-distance exchange networks connected early cities to distant lands, trading prized materials like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and even obsidian from far-flung volcanic sources. These trade links transported not just goods but ideas and technologies, knitting disparate regions into webs of interdependence. Merchants and caravans became vectors of cultural exchange. Along their routes spread pottery styles, religious motifs, and new agricultural techniques. In other river valleys, similar scripts of settlement and urbanization played out with regional flavors. On the Nile, the predictability of the flood cultivated a very different political compact. Ancient Egyptians organized around the annual inundation that deposited nutrient-rich silt, allowing stable and abundant harvests. Because the river's rhythms were so regular, Egyptian authority could centralize into a pharaonic state that claimed divine sanction and managed large-scale building projects, including the awe-inspiring pyramids. Where Mesopotamia developed large temple economies tied to irrigation, Egypt fused religious authority with the person of the pharaoh, whose divine role justified the mobilization of labor for monumental stonework and vast administrative systems. Egyptian writing and hieroglyphs preserved a rich ritual and historical record, used on temple walls and tombs to preserve names and actions for eternity. Yet the daily reality of Egyptian life included bustling villages, craftspeople, and farmers whose labors were counted in the palace and temple ledgers. Across the mountains and deserts to the east, complex societies emerged in the Indus Basin with a unique urban character. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa exhibited remarkable urban planning, with grid streets, standardized brick sizes, and advanced drainage systems that speak of careful civic design. The Indus script remains undeciphered, leaving much of daily ideology and administration open to interpretation, but the material culture reveals complex craft specialization, long-distance trade, and a sophisticated social organization without obvious palatial or temple centers. The Indus civilization's emphasis on plumbing, public baths, and shared infrastructures suggests a civic ethic oriented toward collective hygiene and urban management. Its trade networks extended to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, moving goods, weights, and perhaps technicians. The later decline of those cities around 1900 BCE illustrates how urban systems are vulnerable to environmental change, trade disruptions, and social shifts, forcing new patterns of settlement and power. In the highlands of the Andes, the story of complex society took a different path, often centered on maritime resources and cooperative labor rather than intensive cereal agriculture. The Norte Chico, or Carol, civilization built monumental mounds and plazas long before the rise of pottery or written records, demonstrating that monumental urbanism can be rooted in diverse economic foundations. These societies developed dense settlement systems tied to both coastal fisheries and irrigated agriculture inland, shaping social forms that were fully complex yet distinct from Mesopotamian templates. Across East Asia, communities transitioned toward settled life around millet and rice cultivation. In the Yellow River Basin, Neolithic villages evolved into larger polities characterized by walled towns and bronze work, with the Shang dynasty providing the earliest clear written records through inscribed oracle bones. Those bones reveal a world where divination, ancestor worship, and elite control were central to state life, and where bronze vessels and ritual paraphernalia expressed power within funerary and ceremonial contexts. China's riverine civilizations developed agricultural techniques suited to rice and millet, and they built complex social institutions including hereditary elites and ritual specialists who maintained ideological cohesion. The state formed around control of resources, ritual legitimacy, and the management of warfare and alliances. Over time, technologies such as ironworking, advanced ceramics, and improved agricultural tools spread across East Asia, enabling denser populations and more elaborate political structures. In regions as varied as the Gulf, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Indian subcontinent, settlement led to divergent urban stories. Maritime skills flourished where coastlines offered abundant fish and access to trade, while in other regions the expansion of cereal agriculture produced grain economies with their own logics. The technology and social forms that worked in one environment were often adapted creatively elsewhere, producing a patchwork of early civilizations that shared certain features: surplus, social hierarchy, concentrated population, while differing in ritual, architecture, and economic emphasis. The languages and belief systems of early civilizations often reflected their environmental context and economic base. Rivers were sacred in many societies, and myths of flood and fertility appear repeatedly in Near Eastern and Mesopotamian narratives. In Egypt, the cyclical inundation of the Nile inspired cosmologies of renewal and kingship tied to natural rhythms. Elsewhere, mountain ranges, deserts, and oceans imposed different symbolic geographies that shaped how people imagined their place in the world. Gendered roles in early settled societies were complex and malleable, shaped by local ecology and social organization rather than rigid universal rules. In many communities, women were central to the cultivation and processing of food, to textile manufacture, and to domestic economies, while men might be more associated with heavy labor, long-distance trade, or certain ritual offices. Over time, the rise of inheritance laws, private property, and stratified leadership often produced more pronounced gender hierarchies, but archaeological evidence reminds us these trajectories varied greatly across places and epochs. Childhood and aging, often invisible in grand narratives of kings and battles, were central to household continuity in early settlements. Children learned skills by imitation and apprenticeship, embedded in daily life and rituals, while elders carried vital stores of knowledge about seasons, genealogies, and ritual propriety. Social cohesion depended on these intergenerational bonds as much as on public institutions, and the strategies families used to accumulate resources and alliances shaped broader social networks. Religion and ritual provided moral architecture for early communities and were intertwined with authority and economics. Temples were not merely places of worship but also hubs of redistribution, craft production, and record keeping. And priestly classes often managed land and labor on a scale that rivaled or complemented secular rulers. Ritual calendars structured agricultural labor and festivals, reinforcing social bonds and legitimizing leaders through narratives of cosmic order and divine favor. As cities matured, conflict and warfare became more organized and consequential. Fortifications, weapons, and standing militia emerged as communities defended resources or sought to expand control. Military needs could accelerate technological innovation and centralization, as rulers who could mobilize greater force often gained advantage. Yet warfare also placed heavy demands on societies, requiring taxes or tribute that could strain the social compact and provoke resistance or collapse. Collapse itself is not a single kind of event, but a bundle of processes that can produce fragmentation, transformation, and sometimes creative renewal. Some collapses were rapid, triggered by invasion or catastrophic climate shifts, while others were protracted declines as trade faltered and elites lost legitimacy. The late Bronze Age collapse in the eastern Mediterranean and the earlier decline of some Mesopotamian polities both show how interconnectedness can make cities vulnerable when networks warp or dry up. Environmental degradation, soil salinization from irrigation, deforestation for timber, and changing rainfall patterns played a role in many ancient declines, but social factors also mattered. Elite mismanagement, overtaxation, internal strife, and the rise of competing regions all reshaped the fortunes of cities. These dynamics remind us that the life cycles of civilizations are ecological and political, entwined in ways that echo into our own complex world. Even as cities rose and fell, the technologies and ideas they produced diffused widely, seeding subsequent cultural developments. Mathematical knowledge, calendrical systems, and astronomical observations from early Mesopotamia influenced later societies across Eurasia. The wheel, writing, and metallurgy traveled along trade routes and over generations, sometimes recombined in new contexts to produce innovations neither ancestor nor recipient might fully predict. Stories and identities were woven from archaeological memory and literary invention, and these narratives helped new polities claim ancient heritages. Dynasties invoked the deeds of founding kings, priests recited myths to legitimate property claims, and urban elites curated public performances that bound diverse populations. The act of remembering itself was political, shaping how societies understood continuity and change. The spread of literacy produced new forms of governance and subjectivity. When people could write down laws, contracts, and histories, they created durable records that outlived individual lives and stabilized expectations across time and space. Education systems emerged to teach scribal arts, and those who mastered writing gained access to administrative power. The institutionalization of literacy thus deepened inequalities but also anchored complex economies and facilitated long-distance communication. Material culture, pottery styles, beads, textiles, and architectural motifs served as visible markers of group identity and exchange. Objects moved through markets, pilgrimage routes, and elite gift exchanges, carrying aesthetic and symbolic meanings. Archaeologists trace these flows to reconstruct networks of influence and to read the subtle language of contact, imitation, and innovation across regions. Cities were also centers of food processing and craft specialization. Mills, kilns, and workshops concentrated labor and expertise, while surplus storage allowed for seasonal work rhythms that centralized production at specific times. Court-sponsored industries produced luxury goods for elites and for export, but many crafts remained local and domestic, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The arts flourished where patrons and craftsmen met, and early civilizations left us masterpieces in stone, clay, and metal. Reliefs, statues, and painted ceramics reveal religious iconography, daily scenes, and political propaganda, offering windows into how ancient people saw themselves. Music and performance, though less often preserved, were integral to ritual and social life, with instruments and songs accompanying work, feast, and mourning. Medicine and health in early settled contexts combined folk practices with growing empirical knowledge. Herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and ritual healing coexisted, and urban centers sometimes developed specialized healers and texts compiling medical recipes. Dense populations brought new disease dynamics, but settled life also permitted the accumulation of knowledge that could be passed to apprentices and recorded for future generations. The development of monetary systems and standardized weights changed urban economies, making trade more efficient and reliable. While many transactions remained in kind or through redistribution, standardized measures allowed contracts to be enforced and long-distance trade to flourish. The appearance of coinage in later periods further accelerated market exchange, but even before coins, units of weight and commodity standards were crucial for a functioning urban economy. Gender, labor, and property intersected in the creation of social norms and legal structures that governed inheritance, marriage, and the rights of individuals. Legal texts illuminate expectations about dowries, property transfer, and family obligations, underscoring how economic concerns permeated intimate domains. Over time, the consolidation of property rights and lineage-based inheritance contributed to the persistence of ruling classes and the reproduction of social inequality. Urban landscapes themselves recorded priorities and boundaries, with city walls marking security, temples marking sacred centers, and roads directing flows of trade and people. The placement of markets, administration buildings, and elite quarters encoded power relations, while city planning, when present, reflected ideals of order and control. Over centuries, cities accreted layers of building and rebuilding, creating palimpsests where new regimes reused older foundations. Population pressures and environmental constraints produced waves of migration that reshaped cultural maps. People moved in search of fertile land, traded opportunities, or refuge from conflict, and those movements spread languages, crafts, and genetic lineages. Migration could catalyze cultural fusion as incoming groups adapted and adopted local practices while introducing new technologies and social forms. Religion and statecraft were often mutual allies in the consolidation of authority. Rulers claimed divine sanction to justify taxation, labor levies, and territorial control, while priests legitimized leaders through ritual performance and the maintenance of sacred spaces. This symbiosis created durable institutions that could mobilize vast resources for irrigation projects, military expeditions, and monumental construction. As centuries passed, polities expanded into empires by annexing neighboring regions and integrating diverse peoples into administrative frameworks. Empires required systems of governance that could manage distant provinces, often relying on local intermediaries, tribute payments, and standardized administrative practices. The complexity of imperial administration pushed forward bureaucratic innovations, including regularized tax systems and the integration of local elites into broader state networks. Learning, science, and philosophy emerged when surplus and institutions allowed for reflection beyond immediate subsistence. Astronomical observations were used to regulate calendars and agricultural cycles, and early mathematics developed to support surveying, accounting, and architecture. Philosophical and theological reflection about human place in the cosmos also grew, weaving together cosmology, ethics, and governance and systems that shaped how people understood the world. Cities fostered public life in new ways, creating spaces for debate, spectacle, and civic participation, albeit often limited to select groups. Assemblies, councils, and courts regulated urban affairs, while festivals and public rituals reinforced cohesion and marked the cyclical passage of time. Public performance and communal memory turned domestic knowledge into shared narratives that bound larger populations together. The diffusion of writing and administrative practices carved new possibilities for law and governance. Written codes, treaties, and royal inscriptions announced the terms of social life across generations, creating continuity and sometimes rigidity. Yet texts also allowed reformers and new rulers to reinterpret traditions, enabling social change under the banner of ancient authority. In many places, cities served as incubators for technological innovation that later spread to rural areas, improving plows, irrigation techniques, or crop rotations, and thus enabling agricultural expansion. New tools and organized labor allowed farmers to cultivate heavier soils and to bring marginal lands into production, extending the reach of civilizations. But such expansion often came at ecological cost, increasing dependence on vulnerable monocultures and exposing societies to the perils of drought or disease. The cosmetic markers of elite identity, dress, jewelry, and ornament, both celebrated wealth and performed social boundaries, signaling who belonged to privilege. Luxury goods were often made from non-local materials, underscoring the role of long-distance trade in constructing elite identities. Ceremonial display thus connected local hierarchies to broad networks of exchange and symbolic value. Throughout their trajectories, early civilizations demonstrated remarkable adaptability, borrowing and innovating as circumstances required. The interplay of continuity and change defined their histories, with institutions and ideologies evolving in step with material conditions. Even in decline or transformation, these societies left enduring legacies, technologies, myths, and infrastructures that influenced successors. When nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples encountered urban centers, interactions ranged from trade and alliance to raid and conquest, and those encounters shaped frontier dynamics and cultural exchange. Some pastoral groups supplied urban markets with meat and hides, while others served as vectors for ideas and technologies. These borderlands were liminal spaces where identities could be negotiated and new social forms forged. Religion and myth provided frameworks for making sense of disasters, victories, and demographic shifts, and sacred narratives could be adapted to new rulers and circumstances. Sacred texts and ritual calendars served to integrate diverse populations, offering a shared symbolic vocabulary even as political control changed hands. In many cases, conquest did not erase local practices but rather layered additional meanings upon them, leading to syncretic religious expressions. Artisans occupied a special place in ancient economies, combining technical mastery with artistic sensitivity to produce objects that were functional, aesthetic, and symbolic. Potters shaped everyday vessels and ritual ceramics, metalworkers forged tools and ceremonial objects, and weavers produced textiles that marked status and identity. The training of artisans and the transmission of craft secrets often took place within household workshops or guild-like associations. Foodways defined daily life and ritual practice, with staple crops complemented by fish, meat, and foraged foods varying by locale. Fermentation and preservation techniques extended the use of seasonal foods, creating stable supplies and culinary traditions. Shared meals and feasts reinforced social ties, marking life cycle events and political alliances with food as a central medium of exchange and hospitality. Healthcare and disease management adapted as urbanization created new epidemiological environments. Sewer systems and public baths in some cities reduced local risks, but dense living also facilitated the spread of contagions. Medical practitioners in various regions combined empirical treatments with ritualized healing, reflecting a pragmatic approach to well-being. Education, when formalized, created elite cadres who could manage complex administrations. Scribes and other trained professionals learned not only technical skills but also the cultural codes that bound ruling classes together. Education systems became gates of opportunity, reproducing class distinctions while also enabling careers that powered the machinery of the state. Maritime innovation transformed trade where coasts permitted seafaring, enabling exchanges across seas that knitted distant cultures together. Seafaring communities developed shipbuilding skills, navigation techniques, and port infrastructures that supported exotic trade. Maritime connections allowed for the diffusion of crops, technologies, and even linguistic elements, accelerating cultural change on a broad scale. Cities functioned as living libraries where accumulated knowledge could be stored and transmitted. Archives of tablets and scrolls preserved administrative data, literary works, and scientific observations, and the practice of recording totaled not just transactions but also human thought. Libraries and archives thus became key institutions for continuity, memory, and intellectual development. The construction of monumental architecture required specialized labor, modeled administrative coordination, and often spiritual legitimation. Stone quarries, timber transport, and coordinated labor forces had to be orchestrated, revealing complex logistics and incentives behind great building projects. Monumental constructions shaped landscapes and psyches alike, creating visible stakes for rulers who wanted to claim permanence. The interplay between local autonomy and centralized authority varied greatly across regions. Some city-states maintained strong local identities and rivalries while coordinating in loose federations, whereas others consolidated under larger monarchies or empires. These political forms reflected particular economic and geographic conditions, with no single model dominating universally. Technological exchange often occurred through itinerant craftsmen who moved between cities, carrying knowledge rather than just goods. These mobile specialists spread pottery techniques, metallurgical methods, and agricultural innovations that could be adapted to local contexts. Their movement across landscapes partly explains the rapid spread of practical innovations even when political borders were firm. The histories of early civilizations are also stories of resilience and reinvention, as communities adapted to new crops, new climates, and new political realities. People repurposed old buildings, retold ancestral myths to fit new circumstances, and forged alliances to face common threats. In this way, the past was a living resource, continually reinterpreted to meet present needs. Trade fairs, marketplaces, and caravanserais became focal points of cultural contact where languages mingled and new social practices emerged. Markets were not merely places of exchange but also of social interaction, where news, fashions, and political opinions traveled as readily as commodities. These spaces were crucial to the vitality of urban life, sustaining both economy and conversation. Institutions of punishment and reward evolved to manage increasingly anonymous interactions in cities, with courts and officials adjudicating disputes and maintaining order. Legal codes reflected contemporary values and practical concerns, balancing property rights, debt obligations, and community standards. Enforcement mechanisms ranged from restitution to corporal punishment, revealing the moral economy of each society. Environmental management, including reforestation, terrace agriculture, and water conservation, became central to the longevity of settled life in many regions. Some societies developed sophisticated land use practices that preserved fertility, while others succumbed to short-term exploitation that degraded the landscape. The choices communities made about resource stewardship often determined their long-term sustainability. The notion of identity shifted as people encountered strangers and strangers became neighbors, and cities cultivated civic languages and rituals that could absorb diverse populations. Shared festivals, markets, and public works promoted a sense of belonging that transcended kinship, even as lineage and clan identities persisted. Urban citizenship thus became another mode of identity alongside ethno-linguistic and familial ties. Monetary wealth, accumulated through trade, tribute, and land, translated into political power, enabling elites to fund armies, rituals, and monumental works. Control over wealth distribution shaped social hierarchies and political loyalties, with patronage networks linking rulers to craftsmen, soldiers, and priests. Economic control underpinned governance, and disputes over resources often drove major political changes. The arts and intellectual traditions of ancient civilizations often transcended their original contexts, influencing subsequent cultures through translation, imitation, and adaptation. Literary works, religious texts, and scientific treatises migrated across empires, translated into new tongues and reinterpreted for fresh audiences. Such intellectual mobility allowed ancient insights to be woven into the thinking of later societies. As the first settlements matured into cities, the scale of human imagination and organization expanded, producing legacies that resonate today. The inventions of writing, the wheel, metallurgy, and urban governance continue to shape modern life in ways that are rarely acknowledged in everyday moments. Those earliest experiments with settlement and surplus set the stage for millennia of human achievement and challenge. The story of civilization is therefore not a single line but a braided narrative of local experiments, environmental contingencies, and human creativity. From the attentive practices of foragers to the complex institutions of emperors, the movement towards settlement involved thousands of small decisions across many generations. Each village and city contributed its own chapter to a collective human story about how people learned to stay, to store, and to imagine futures that spanned beyond individual lifetimes. When we look at ancient ruins and shards, we see not only the marks of elite ambition but also the traces of ordinary lives, cooking hearths, children's toys, and worn tools that sustained civilizations day after day. These material remains remind us that civilizations were made by countless people whose names we rarely know, whose labor and love enabled councils to convene and temples to rise. Their stories are embedded in the soil, awaiting voices to translate silent fragments into human narrative. The early settlements and first urban centers taught successive generations about scale and cooperation, showing both the power and peril of human concentration. They revealed that social complexity could produce artistic brilliance, scientific insight, and enduring institutions, but also that complexity could amplify ecological fragility and social inequality. The lesson is neither cautionary nor triumphalist. It is a sober recognition of the ambiguous potential of human organization. Across the centuries, new urban experiments continued to emerge, adapt, and sometimes dissolve, but the core human aspiration remained the same: to create places where life could be sustained, shared, and made meaningful. Villages grew into cities, cities into polities, and polities into empires, each stage a human response to environmental opportunity and social possibility. The oldest civilization is not a single place but a pattern, a testament to the human capacity to reconfigure living arrangements in pursuit of safety, abundance, and meaning. Listen as the world leans back from the ice and the last great glaciers retreat, leaving rivers to carve new paths and seas to settle into shapes they would keep for millennia. The lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile's floodplain, the valleys of the Indus and the Yellow River, and the sheltered plateaus of Anatolia all begin to warm and green in ways that invite a different kind of life. Here and there, small human bands find they need no longer follow herds across empty winters. They can plant, tend, and return to the same soil year by year. That return, the act of coming back to a place with intention, is the first note in the long song that will become cities and writing. When people stop roaming and start tending, the rhythms of life change from chase to craft. Seeds are small, but their consequences are vast: cereals and pulses, sheep and goats, flax for thread, and eventually wheat and barley that could be stored to outlast bad seasons. With surpluses come time and different kinds of work, and that spare time becomes skill: pottery, weaving, building, and trial and error experiments with water and soil. Those skills cluster around reliable resources and, over generations, cluster into permanent habitations that grow and thicken like rings around a river's bend. I want you to picture a first village: sunlight on mud brick walls, smoke rising from communal hearths, children weaving mud into toy pots while elders mend a basket. Houses are not yet streets so much as a spread of linked courtyards, each family a unit of labor and memory. There is a rhythm of planting and harvest, and with it a calendar of festivals and rites to mark luck and honor the cycles. These rituals will be the first architectures of belief, shaping how people think about seasons, gods, and each other. The earliest villages are subtle laboratories. In the Fertile Crescent, a culture we call Natufian begins to spend winters in stone-built dwellings, harvesting wild cereals with flint sickles. In the Levant and Anatolia, communities such as Catalhoyuk grow into dense settlements where houses are entered from roofs and walls are painted with vivid scenes of animals and ritual. In the Jordan Valley, Jericho deepens its tell, layers upon layers of habitation, while a tower stands as a monument to community labor and shared purpose. Each of these places offers a different experiment in permanence and social organization, and together they teach a basic lesson: living in one place changes what people can imagine doing together. The leap from large villages to cities is not a single event but a long, braided process. It involves more than building bigger houses. It transforms how labor is organized, how goods move, and how people negotiate power. In southern Mesopotamia, rivers braid into marshes and channels, and it is in this watery landscape that the first great cities will coalesce. The marshes encourage technologies of irrigation and water control, and where water is managed at scale, cooperation is rewarded by increased productivity. That reward draws more people and specialties, and the city begins to look like an engine for complexity rather than a simple accumulation of people. Uruk, a name that will come to haunt the history of cities, grows out of the Abate settlements into a sprawling urban center of temples, workshops, and homes. Here, monumental architecture rises, platforms and temples that push up from the plain as if to touch the sky. These are not merely places of worship, they are centers of production and distribution, concentrating grain, metalwork, textiles, and craft knowledge. Enormous mud brick walls encircle parts of the city, signaling both a capacity to marshal labor and a sense of belonging that can be defended or displayed. Temples are the heart of early cities because they are the place where ritual, economy, and governance intertwine. The temple precinct holds storehouses of grain and goods, records of offerings, and the personnel who manage these resources. Priests or temple officials administer allocations, allocate labor for irrigation and construction, and coordinate festivals that persuade people to cooperate. The temple thus becomes a public ledger and a ritual stage at once, and the need to record complex transactions will push the human brain toward new symbolic techniques. To record something, you must first devise a sign that stands for it. The earliest marks are humble, tokens of clay shaped into spheres, cones, and discs, each representing a quantity or commodity. These small objects travel in people's pockets, and their pockets are sealed into envelopes of baked clay called bulli to show a package's contents. It is a simple idea, but one with vast consequences: representation detached from the physical commodity. A token can stand in for barley or oil or livestock, and once tokens are used, there is a path toward abstract marks on durable surfaces. The story of writing begins in the bookkeeping of cities and the practical need to track rations, labor, and offerings. Around 5,000 years ago, in southern Mesopotamia, tokens start to be pressed into clay tablets, and impressions of tokens and cord marks evolve into pointing signs and pictographs. These pictographs are pictures at first, drawings of a jar, an ear of barley, a head of cattle, and the images are used to record quantities and names. Over time, the pictures compact and stylize, pressed by a reed stylus into soft clay, until the signs are no longer pictures of things but symbols of words, numbers, and sounds. A deep reason for the stylization lies in the tools. A pointed reed makes wedge-shaped marks, and the wedge becomes the hallmark of a new script. That script, we call cuneiform because of the wedge or cuneus mark, carries within it a history of transformation, from tokens to impressed marks, from picture to abstract sign, and from commodity list to narrative. You can hear in the scratches the breath of bureaucrats, the patience of scribes, the clack of administrative activity in temples and palaces where memory is externalized into clay. This is the moment when human minds begin to offload memory into durable, portable records. Writing does not spring fully formed everywhere, it grows in stages and in different places. While Mesopotamia develops its wedge-shaped system, Egypt fashions hieroglyphs that are sometimes literal pictures and sometimes symbolic signs. In the Indus Valley, we find short signs on seals that suggest a unique script with its own rules, though it remains undeciphered. In the Yellow River Basin, signs later become the bones carved for divination, and in Mesoamerica a different invention will arise long after, with its own trajectory. What binds these inventions is a common pressure, densely organized societies needing to record, enforce, and remember. A new professional class emerges from this pressure, the scribes. Training to write is long and arduous, clay tablet after tablet, copying lists and patterns until the hand learns the script's memory. Scribes become indispensable because writing is not only a technology but a language of power that requires apprenticeship. In the Aduba, or tablet house, young students practice signs and numbers, learning not only how to record transactions but how to compose letters, hymns, and laws. The scribal profession concentrates knowledge, and scribes mediate between rulers and subjects, temples and traders. Because writing is born in administration, the earliest texts are often mundane: rations for workers, lists of offerings, contracts, and receipts. Yet hidden within these mundane marks are the seeds of literature. Administrative lists teach systems of categorization and grammar. They accustom the culture to thinking about sequence and causality. From these building blocks grow hymns that praise deities with the same formal precision used to account for grain, and eventually to stories that imagine gods as characters with desires and flaws. The bureaucratic ledger and the mythic song emerge from the same technological impulse to capture thought externally. As cities expand, specialization deepens. There are potters who know the temper of clay, metallurgists who modulate fire and alloy, weavers who count threads by pattern, and merchants who track routes and exchanges across hundreds of miles. Long-distance trade links distant sources of stone, timber, and precious lapis lazuli, and that trade requires treaties, seals, and written agreements. Cylinder seals, small engraved tubes rolled across wet clay, become personal signatures. Each impressed design is a compact identity card that travels with goods, a private emblem on public records. Those seals are both aesthetic and legal, private art with the force of authentication. The built city reflects that specialization. Streets deviate from a simple grid to accommodate workshops, marketplaces, and ministerial archives. Neighborhoods form around craft concentrations, and there are distinct quarters for temples, palaces, and sprawling storage complexes. Public works such as drainage systems, canals, and levees require collective planning and enforcement. The capacity to coordinate these projects transforms small settlements into something new, an infrastructure of obligations and a political architecture of authority. Power itself becomes more visible and formalized. In the earliest cities, authority is often shared among temple elites and assemblies of elders, but as wealth accumulates, charismatic figures consolidate oversight into dynastic offices. Leaders claim divine sanction for their authority. Kingship becomes a theatrical and administrative fusion. Rulers build terraces, sponsor festivals, and commission monumental inscriptions that both document and cultivate memory. The inscription is a public claim. The ruler's deeds are written in clay and stone for future generations to contest or admire. Writing gives rulers a new weapon and a new burden. With inscriptions, they can legitimize power, codify obligations, and issue decrees. With writing comes law, not only customary practice but written codes that bind citizens and officials alike. The move from custom to coded statute is not instantaneous, but we see early examples of laws and administrative regulations that define penalties, resolve disputes, and standardize weights and measures. The codification of law makes social expectations explicit and transmissible beyond the living memory of elders. Cities are turbulent laboratories of inequality. Surpluses underwrite luxury goods and the conspicuous display of status, ivory inlays, imported stones, and finely hammered metalwork. The archaeological record shows elite burials laden with objects that must have been expensive and long worked. Yet beneath conspicuous wealth, most urban residents live lives tied to subsistence, relying on rations and regulated labor. That shared dependence on centralized distribution systems makes urban populations politically legible and easier to administer, or to starve in times of coercion. The environmental consequences of early urban life are profound and often paradoxical. Irrigation brings bounty, but also the slow accumulation of salts that can undermine fertility. Deforestation for bricks and fuel accelerates erosion and changes microclimates. Cities grow by drawing resources from wider hinterlands, reshaping landscapes across hundreds of kilometers. Those ecological stresses can be gradual, and in archaeological registers they often show as shifting settlement patterns, abandonment of fields, or migration to new lands. The fragility of early urban systems teaches a repeated lesson in the ancient world: prosperity is contingent and often reversible. As cities grow, so too does warfare. Competition over water, land, and trade routes leads to organized violence and the fortification of urban centers. Bronze Age technologies of weaponry and the ability to field specialized soldiers transform disputes into sieges and campaigns. The presence of walls and gates, garrisoned by trained forces, signals a move from community defense to institutionalized military power. That institutionalization demands logistics and record-keeping, which in turn strengthens the bureaucratic systems that birthed writing. Religion in the city evolves alongside the state. Gods and goddesses take on civic personae. A city is often seen as the city of a particular deity who owns the land and grants its prosperity. Ritual calendars regulate both agriculture and labor, and festivals reinforce social bonds while legitimating elites who lead the rites. Temple economies often control vast tracts of land and labor, and their ability to mobilize resources blurs the line between sacred and secular. The city, then, is as much a sacred landscape as an economic machine. The first cities are also places of innovation and thought. Early astronomers and mathematicians, often temple-trained, observe celestial cycles to fix calendars and coordinate agricultural work. To measure land and divide goods, they develop arithmetic systems that are practical and sophisticated, with numerical tablets recording calculations for fields and stores. Geometry and fractions emerged not from abstract curiosity at first, but from projects like building canals, allocating rations, and dividing estates. Knowledge grows because practical problems in cities incentivize conceptual tools. The physical forms of writing change as the technology and administrative demands shift. From tablet to seal to inscription on stone, the medium influences the style and function of texts. Clay tablets are pliable, easy to mass-produce and archive, and they survive burial because fired clay resists the elements. Papyrus and perishable media exist, too, but often perish unless preserved, thus our view of early writing is biased toward durable materials. Yet the lost lyric of a singer written on reed or bark may have been as vital culturally as a preserved administrative ledger, even if it leaves little trace. Storytelling and myth-making find ways to take advantage of the new medium. Once scribes can set down names, events, and sequences, they can craft epic narratives that revisit the distant past with a mixture of memory and invention. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerges from Sumerian court tales and temple hymns, maturing into a long narrative that contemplates friendship, mortality, and the quest for meaning. Such narratives are both literary and pedagogical. They instruct elites and general listeners on ideals, anxieties, and the cultural identity of the city. Literacy, of course, is limited at first. Most people do not read, and writing functions as a technology of power carried by an elite. But as states expand and trade networks widen, literacy trickles outward through merchants, craftsmen, and provincial administrators. Legal documents, contracts, and letters circulate among an expanding class of readers and writers, and with that circulation come opportunities for critique, reform, and cultural exchange. Writing becomes a medium for negotiation as much as for command. The diffusion of urban and writing technologies is uneven, and different regions take them up in distinct shapes. Egypt's writing system and monumental state form develop along the Nile, shaped by its annual floods and centralized uplift. The Indus cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro show deep planning, urban sanitation, and a script we cannot yet read, perhaps used for commercial seals and municipal signage. China's early writing, later seen on oracle bones, grows in a context of ritual divination and kinship politics. Each center follows a path molded by environment, economy, and local beliefs, and yet they all touch the same underlying dynamic, denser social life producing symbolic technologies. Trade is a circulatory system for ideas as well as goods. Caravans and ships carry not just timber and metals but also motifs, techniques, and administrative practices. Seals from Mesopotamia end up in Anatolia and the Indus, and imported materials such as lapis lazuli and tin forge networks that link the mountains to the plains. Along these routes scribes meet other scribes, craftsmen encounter new designs, and practices such as standardizing weights and measures spread because commerce demands reliable norms. Cities develop as nodes and wide networks where writing becomes a lingua franca for contracts and records. The visual culture of early cities is striking and symbolic. Reliefs, carved stele, and seal impressions condense complex social and cosmological relationships into single images. Kings and gods are often shown together, a visual shorthand for the fusion of sacral and secular power. Scenes of procession and ritual on seals teach viewers who stands where in the order of things, and they are portable reminders of rank that can be rolled into wet clay and lodged into public records. In this way, art is a medium of governance as much as it is of beauty. Cities are laboratories for institutional innovation beyond administration and writing. Markets develop standards for contracts and credit. Guild-like organizations form around crafts. Kinship and patronage networks entwine with state offices. Debt instruments and the legal enforcement of obligations transform personal relationships into economic relations, and courts and adjudicators begin to shape fair play and redress. The layering of institutions formalizes social expectations and stabilizes complex exchanges that would have been impossible in a dispersed hunter-gatherer context. One of the profound consequences of writing is the extension of memory beyond the human lifetime. A tablet inscribed and stored in an archive can count as evidence long after witnesses are dead. This temporal reach changes politics. Claims can be supported by documentary proof, contracts can be enforced across generations, and institutions can maintain continuity. What is recorded accrues authority not simply by social consensus but by material durability. In that sense, writing becomes a technology that freezes social arrangements and allows them to be inherited. The cognitive culture of cities shifts too. With texts, people learn to trace argument and maintain records of thought. Memory itself becomes externalized. Scribes trained in lists and formulas develop ways of thinking that privilege classification, causality, and precedent. Even imagination changes. The ability to manipulate abstract signs enables new forms of speculation and classification that feed into law, theology, and science. The city fosters a reflective habit of mind where the written record is both resource and instrument. As early states grow, they produce larger and more complex histories because more actors, events, and offices need to be recorded. The archive becomes a repository of political memory and a resource for future rulers seeking legitimacy. Governments institutionalize the preservation of documents, and monumental inscriptions memorialize boundary changes, triumphs, and pious acts. Over time, editing and literary compilation emerge as scribes collect older texts, reinterpret them, and craft narratives that serve present needs. Yet writing is not merely instrumental, it also fosters empathy and narrative exploration. Letters carved into clay convey personal anxieties, directives, and gossip. Private correspondence preserved in archives shows domestic disputes, household management, and the grudges of neighbors. Those fragments humanize a past often reduced to its monumental remains. They show that ancient urbanites worried about delayed shipments, missing workers, and family matters in ways not unlike ours. The interaction between central authorities and local communities is mediated through writing and numeracy. Taxation records, corvée labor lists, and allocated rations are instruments to govern a wide populace. Local officials translate metropolitan edicts into practical arrangements, and local notables negotiate with central administrators through written petitions or sealed agreements. This vertical communication is critical for state coherence and often leaves traces in court tablets and correspondence that reveal the granular mechanics of governance. Technological knowledge spreads within and between cities. Metallurgy improves as alloy recipes circulate, pottery techniques refine through imitation and innovation, agricultural methods adapt to new crops and irrigation regimes. Workshops teach apprentices, and guild-like institutions enforce standards that ensure quality and reputation in distant markets. The physical and intellectual labor of cities becomes a cumulative enterprise, each generation building upon the innovations of the last. Language itself is transformed by writing. Once signs become abstract carriers of sound, scripts can encode not just nouns but grammatical relationships and phonetics. This allows for the faithful transmission of speech across time and space, preserving legal formulas, epic recitations, and sacred hymns with more fidelity than oral tradition alone. As phonetic elements increase within writing systems, scribes gain flexibility to express new names and foreign words, making written records more adaptable to expanding polities. Education becomes a social institution as well. The Aduba is not merely a craft school but an apparatus for social reproduction. It inculcates loyalty to tradition while also training officials capable of running complex bureaucracies. Students copy canonical texts, learn proverbs, and absorb the moral and political philosophy of their culture. Education thus becomes a means by which elites perpetuate social norms and ensure continuity of governance across generations. The archaeological record shows that cities are both centers of innovation and of accumulation of knowledge. Libraries of clay tablets appear in temple and palace archives, and their catalogs provide a map of the intellectual landscape. Scribes organize knowledge into lexical lists, topical collections, and indices that aid retrieval and learning. That organization is a precursor to libraries in the modern sense, and it reveals an impulse toward comprehensive preservation of human thought that begins in the earliest urban archives. Disease and health in cities present another challenge. Dense habitation, proximity to animals, and the mobilization of labor create conditions for epidemics that were less probable in dispersed bands. Medical knowledge becomes more specialized as treatments, herbal remedies, and surgical techniques are tried and recorded. Physicians in temples both treat patients and advise administrators on public health measures, sometimes preserving their findings on tablets for future practitioners. Urban life thus generates medical systems that are both empirical and ritualized. The integration of peripheral regions into urban economies reshapes both the city and its hinterland. Farmers in outlying areas become tied to urban markets through taxation and trade, adopting new crops or irrigation techniques to meet demand. This integration can enrich local elites and create dependencies that reshape social structures. At the same time, the movement of people into cities draws labor and talent away from rural life, accelerating urban growth and cultural diffusion. Monuments and memorials in cities inscribe collective memory into stone and clay. Victory stelae tell of campaigns and prizes, foundation inscriptions mark the construction of temples and canals, votive plaques record pious donations. These texts are public media, meant to be read and reread by passers-by and officials alike. They compress political narratives into durable form, binding citizens to a line of memory that supports contemporary claims to legitimacy. The rise of cities and writing also transforms religious thought. Sacred texts, once orally transmitted, are now committed to clay, allowing priests to fix liturgy and ritual formulae with precision. Theological debates can be recorded, compared, and resolved, or preserved for posterity if unresolved. The textualization of belief produces canonical corpora that guide practice and legitimize priestly authority in new ways. Statecraft and diplomacy become literate arts. Treaties, letters of alliance, and restrictive trade agreements circulate among ruling houses in sealed form. Written correspondence creates permanent records of negotiations and offers a degree of protection for merchants and envoys moving across volatile political landscapes. Diplomatic practices depend on trained scribes to compose language that can be read and endorsed by distant courts, making writing indispensable to early interstate relations. The urban and textual revolution also affects timekeeping and chronology. Kings count their years by regnal cycles, and important events are listed on king lists, creating a framework for historical memory. Astronomical observations are logged to calibrate calendars, align festivals to seasons, and predict eclipses that bear political and religious significance. This effort to root political power within a measurable temporal order is essential for large polities that span generations. Economy and accounting evolve complex instruments such as credit and various forms of debt. Clay tablets record loans, interest, and the transfer of agricultural yields as guarantees. Early legal instruments specify remedies for default and rules for collateral. These financial technologies enable larger projects and longer supply chains, but also create entanglements of obligation that can lead to social tension and reform. Writing fosters introspection and philosophical thought. As abstract symbols accumulate, thinkers begin to outline ethical maxims, cosmologies, and speculative inquiries about life and death. Wisdom literature develops, capturing proverbs, didactic tales, and reflections on human conduct. These texts circulate within elite circles and inform the moral imagination of urban societies. The seduction of permanence encourages rulers and institutions to build archives and libraries as material bulwarks against oblivion. The desire to write one's deeds into long-lasting media is a way of pursuing immortality in fragments. For ordinary people, the written word can be a shield against injustice, a proof of debt repayment, or an instrument of property rights. For elites, it is a way to fashion legacies and shape the stories that will be told after they are gone. Sometimes the very abundance of records destabilizes the picture. Archives are messy, bureaucratic redundancy creates contradictions, and later rulers edit or erase earlier records. Clay tablets can be recut and reallocated, and inscriptions can be defaced in acts of damnatio memoriae. Yet the layers preserved in archaeological digs give us a complex palimpsest, revealing not a single narrative but many voices, competing claims, and the messy reality of social life. Cities and writing co-evolve in feedback loops. The demands of administration push writing to become more flexible, and writing in turn enables larger and more complex polities. As writing encodes legal and economic norms, cities can scale and manage populations that would otherwise be impossible to coordinate. This mutual reinforcement is a core reason why the urban revolution and the textual revolution are inseparable in ancient history. Environmental shocks and economic crises test the resilience of urban systems. Droughts, salinization, and political fragmentation can undermine agricultural bases, forcing cities to adapt or shrink. Some cities display remarkable resilience through reforms, irrigation changes, or new trade routes. Others are abandoned when the systems that sustained them fail. Those cycles of rise, adaptation, and sometimes collapse are as much a part of the ancient urban story as its monuments and inventions. Gender roles and the place of women in urban society are complex and varied. Temple institutions sometimes offer women avenues of power as priestesses or economic managers, and elite women can own property and participate in contracts. At the same time, labor divisions and legal codes often reflect male-dominated hierarchies. Our textual and archaeological evidence illuminates both the opportunities and constraints women faced in early cities, suggesting diverse realities rather than monolithic patterns. Law and justice become public spectacles and private instruments. Courts sit to resolve disputes that writing has made visible: inheritance, debt, and allegations of theft. Legal decisions are often written, and judgments can set precedents that guide future conduct. In this way, law becomes an accumulating tradition that both stabilizes expectations and provides avenues for contestation. The aesthetics of record-keeping are surprising. Scribes sometimes write with elegance, composing school texts that double as literary exercises, and seal engravers produce miniature masterpieces that combine utility with artistry. The tactile pleasure of a well-formed sign or a finely incised seal matters in a culture where visual and material signs carry authority. This intertwining of beauty and bureaucracy reminds us that ancient people sought not only efficiency but also meaning in the artifacts they produced. Cities are crucibles of identity. As people from hinterlands, distant regions, and different crafts gather, they form new civic identities alongside older kin-based affiliations. Festivals, public rituals, and shared archives provide a narrative of belonging, and written decrees teach newcomers the rules of the polis or city-state. Over generations, residents come to identify themselves by the names and myths of the city as much as by region or lineage. The earliest bureaucracies face recurrent problems: corruption, inefficiency, and the temptation to monopolize power. Leaders invent audits, inspection tours, and written ledgers to check officials, but these systems can be imperfect and are sometimes circumvented by social networks. The tension between transparency and collected power is ancient, and it plays out in the clay tablets that record bribes, delayed payments, and administrative pleas. These imperfections remind us that institutions are human constructions, perpetually in need of repair. The translation of pictograph to phonetic sign is a technical and cognitive leap. When a sign ceases to represent a thing and begins to represent a sound, the possibilities of writing multiply enormously. Names, foreign words, and grammatical inflections can be written, and the script becomes a vehicle for language itself rather than only for objects. This innovation enables literature, law, and diplomacy to move beyond the narrow needs of accounting toward expressive and conceptual uses. As scripts become more abstract, they also become more portable in meaning. A single sign can represent syllables in multiple languages, serving as a bridge between cultures. Bilingual inscriptions and multilingual scribes become common in cosmopolitan centers, easing trade and diplomacy. The city thus becomes a place where language contact fosters literacy's expansion and complexity. Religion and myth continue to be written down and reworked, so that later generations read theological debates and hymnic revisions as if engaging with a living tradition. Texts are sometimes recited in rituals, blending oral performance with written prompt. The interplay between sound and sign in religious practice is a reminder that writing never fully displaces the spoken word, it augments and anchors it. Finally, the legacy of those first cities and their scripts is immense. They bequeath us systems of record, law, and public architecture that shaped later empires and civilized forms of life. The particular paths of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, and China diverge and converge, but all demonstrate that when people gather densely, they invent technologies, like writing, that transform social relations profoundly. Those technologies allow memory to stray beyond individuals and into institutions, and in that extension lies the power and peril of civilization. Long before nations and empires, before defined borders and printed laws, people clustered at the edges of rivers and in the shallow valleys where water gathered. They learned to cultivate grain, to manage seasonal floods, and to coax abundance from soil that had once been wild. From these practical beginnings grew something that would alter human life forever: organized settlements that became cities, where kings and temples rose like the first promises of order and power. When the first cities took shape, they did so around water and soil, but also around shared ritual and authority. Neighbors who once cooperated informally began to coordinate labor for canals and storage houses, creating patterns of obligation and leadership. Those patterns hardened into offices, titles, and buildings that stood as public witnesses to the new social compact. We often speak of the oldest civilization as if it were a single, neat entity, but in truth it was a mosaic of city-states, each with its own accent of culture and its own rivalries. Cities like Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash cast long shadows over the plain and competed for access to land, labor, and trade. Their leaders sought legitimacy not only by force but by ceremony, by founding temples and sponsoring festivals that bound people to place and to each other. At the center of many cities stood the temple, a layered mound of brick that sometimes rose toward the sky in stepped terraces. These were not merely houses of worship, they were economic engines, administrative centers, and repositories of communal memory. People brought offerings, stored grain, and recorded transactions in the shadow of these walls, and in doing so they made the temple a hub of power. Temples held land and workers, organized labor for irrigation and craft, and maintained the records that nurtured trust between strangers. They measured and labeled, they dispensed rations, and they mediated disputes. The temple household looked, in many ways, like a miniature state. It collected resources, redistributed food, and sponsored artisans who made the symbolic goods of the community. Against that backdrop of temple organization, kings emerged with a different claim to authority. Early rulers styled themselves as shepherds of the people, direct agents of the gods who could muster troops, allocate land, and preside over justice. Their palaces were centers of command that mirrored the temple's economy while aiming to monopolize military force and political decision-making. The line between king and priest was often thin. Some rulers were priests by office, others were patrons of the temple, and many wrapped their political ambitions in religious language. A king who rebuilt a temple or publicly honored a deity did more than express piety. He embedded his reign within a sacred narrative that conferred stability and sacral authority. Ceremony mattered because it made abstract authority visible. Coronations, processionals, and foundation rituals turned power into spectacle and memory, inscribing the ruler's legitimacy in stone and story. When a king laid the first brick for a temple or dedicated a carved stela, he turned architecture into proclamation and religious service into political strategy. As the cities grew, so did the need for records. Accounting tablets, carved with scratched impressions and later with cuneiform script, served as mnemonic devices and legal proof. These records tracked grain, labor, trade, and hires, and they allowed administrators to plan large-scale projects that had been impossible for small kin-based groups. Writing itself changed relationships between people and institutions. When transactions could be fixed to clay, when contracts persisted beyond a single memory, trust shifted from personal reputation to written proof. Scribes became indispensable not just as clerks but as managers of knowledge, gatekeepers of bureaucratic power who could translate human interactions into durable forms. The emergence of bureaucracies is one of the most decisive features of early state formation. Administrators oversaw labor drafts, enforced obligations, and coordinated the construction of canals and city walls. With offices and titles came hierarchies of remuneration and command, and the very structure of power began to resemble the modern state in miniature. Kings used new administrative tools to mobilize resources for both war and peace. Walls protected urban life from raids, canals distributed water across fields. These infrastructures demanded coordinated labor and constant upkeep, and they reinforced the idea that some social entity, be it temple or palace, had the authority to command labor and collect surplus. A key element in the rise of state power was the control of surplus. When harvests exceeded immediate consumption, someone had to decide how to store, allocate, or trade that surplus. Temples and palaces often became the custodians of grain, and with stewardship came leverage. Whoever controlled surplus could feed armies, reward officials, and finance monumental projects that symbolized dominance. Early kings were practical and performative. They led campaigns to secure water sources and caravan routes, but they also patronized poets, craftsmen, and builders who told tales of their prowess in enduring forms. A king who commissioned a grand gate or an inscribed stele extended his voice beyond his life, shaping how posterity would perceive his reign. To understand the oldest civilization, we must listen to the stories those rulers left behind. They spoke of struggles with monsters, of bridges to the gods, and of kingship bestowed directly by the divine. Though myth and history entwine, these narratives reveal the moral architecture of power, the ruler as protector, the city as cosmos, and the temple as the nexus of human-divine collaboration. Archaeology has layered those stories with material evidence. Excavations reveal the geometry of streets and the footprints of houses, the kiln sites of potters and the raw remains of marketplace stalls. The ordinary details of life, the size of a bowl, the texture of a woven cloth, the slope of a roof, anchor grand political narratives in everyday choices and labor. One of the oldest cities, Uruk, exemplifies this complicated blend of ritual, economy, and political ambition. Its urban plan, its monumental temple precincts, and its warrior heroes etched into cylinder seals show a society that had mastered both symbolic language and administrative technique. In Uruk, we see the early marriage of spectacle and organization that would characterize later state forms. The figure of the king in these cities could be as literal as a man on a throne or as metaphorical as an office that various leaders assumed. Titles proliferated: Ensi, often a city overseer with strong ties to the temple; Lugal, literally big man, a title associated with military leadership and larger jurisdiction. These roles were responsive to context, flexible enough to adapt as cities confronted external threats or internal fractures. Military organization played a critical role in the consolidation of state power. The ability to recruit, equip, and sustain fighting forces deterred rivals and enabled rulers to expand control. Armies required logistics, food, transport, pay, and those needs pushed further innovations in record-keeping, taxation, and supply chains. Warfare also generated prestige. Victorious kings returned with booty and captives, with tribute that validated their claims to dominance. Victories were commemorated on stelae and palace reliefs, where rulers were portrayed as triumphant before gods and peoples, reinforcing a cosmology where the king's prowess had divine sanction. But power was not only forged in conflict, it also depended on compromise and co-optation. Temples, guilds, and urban elites held resources and influence of their own, and rulers had to negotiate with these groups to maintain stability. Patronage, marriage ties, and the distribution of office could bind elite interests to royal projects, turning potential rivals into partners. Economics and religion interlaced in daily life through ritual economies that blurred sacred and secular boundaries. Gifts to the gods became transactions that sustained priesthoods and artisans, offerings financed temple maintenance and supported festivals that reasserted communal identities. The ritual calendar structured labor and resources, synchronizing agricultural cycles with collective obligations. Calendars themselves were instruments of order. By fixing dates for festivals, taxes, and labor drafts, authorities created rhythms that integrated diverse tasks into a single social tempo. The ability to regulate time and to inscribe it in public records increased the state's capacity to manage people across seasons and years. Scribes and schools emerged to meet the need for trained bureaucrats. Boys, often from elite households, learned to press wedges into clay, to render lists and accounts, and to memorize laws and myths. Literacy was not universal, but it was a source of power. Those who could read and write shaped how transactions were interpreted and how memory was institutionalized. Legal codes would become one of the hallmarks of state authority. When a ruler or assembly declared rules and penalties on stelae, the law gained public, visible force. Codes regulated family life, commercial disputes, property rights, and penalties for theft and violence, solidifying the state's role as arbiter of social order. The famous law collections that have survived, often associated with later rulers, reflect a long process of legal development. They echo older practices of dispute resolution mediated by temple officials or assemblies of elders, showing how emerging states built on pre-existing norms. The codification of law gave rulers another instrument to align social behavior with state needs. Religious theology underpinned many claims to power. Kings were frequently presented as chosen or favored by gods, and in some cases as direct intermediaries who could intercede with divine forces. This theological framework helped unify populations around a single political center, making rebellion not only a civic crime but a sacrilege. Yet religion also contained checks on rulers. Ritual obligations and temple rites could constrain royal ambition, and priesthoods could leverage their sanctuaries to protect their privileges. The interplay between palace and temple produced a dynamic equilibrium in which each side recognized the other's indispensability. Art and architecture communicated power in the language of stone and pigment. Palaces displayed mosaic floors and elaborately carved reliefs of royal hunts and victories, while temples rose in brick and stucco to monumentalize cosmic order. These public works were investments in social memory. They expressed a ruler's capacity to marshal resources and to shape the sensory environment of the city. Craft specialization created the material culture of power. Metalworkers forged weapons and ceremonial objects, lapidaries produced seals that authenticated transactions, potters created standardized vessels for storage and transport. Guilds and workshops often worked in service to temples and palaces, making the material base of ritual and administration. Seals, small carved cylinders or stamp seals, were microinstruments of bureaucracy and identity. Pressed into wet clay, they marked ownership, authenticated records, and encapsulated symbols of lineage or office. The proliferation of seals shows how trust and security were negotiated in physical tokens, a precursor to later means of authentication. Trade networks extended the reach of city-states beyond their immediate hinterlands. Long-distance commerce brought raw materials like timber and metals, and in return cities exported textiles, pottery, and finished goods. Trade created wealth and brought new cultural influences, but it also generated dependencies and incentives for military protection of routes. As trade and tribute accumulated, state economies became more complex. Officials calculated weights, assessed taxes, and managed redistribution, creating layered systems that could generate sustained investments in public works and military readiness. Economic complexity reinforced hierarchies, as those who controlled fiscal levers shaped both the present and the historical narrative of the city. Kings cultivated public image through inscriptions and monumental art. They narrated their achievements in formulaic but powerful ways. They recounted divine favor, military conquest, and temple building. These inscriptions were not mere vanity. They served as legal claims, economic records, and moral instruction, teaching subjects about the proper order of things. One of the richest sources of history is covenantal language that framed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Kings promised to ensure irrigation, to defend the weak, and to uphold justice, an explicit social contract that bound them to duties as well as rights. When rulers failed, that language provided the moral vocabulary for critique and rebellion. The rise of larger polities, such as the Akkadian Empire, illustrated how kings could transcend the city-state model. Under leaders like Sargon, ambitious rulers centralized authority across multiple cities, standardizing administration and projecting power over diverse populations. Empire required new levels of bureaucracy, logistics, and cultural integration, but it also amplified the stakes of imperial collapse. Imperial rule brought both sophistication and fragility. It facilitated monumental construction and the circulation of standardized weights and measures, but it also depended on long supply lines and loyal administrators. When those lines frayed, through drought, rebellion, or external invasion, the centralized system could unravel rapidly. Cycles of consolidation and fragmentation marked the longue durée of the oldest civilization. Periods of relative unity alternated with times when local rulers reasserted autonomy and rival elites competed for control. This ebb and flow produced a political landscape where adaptability was often more valuable than rigid hierarchy. Legal and administrative reforms were continual responses to such challenges. Rulers adjusted tax policies, recalibrated labor drafts, and sometimes reissued laws to address corruption or social unrest. These reforms were rarely neutral. Each change redistributed power and resources, reshaping alliances and rivalries. One of the enduring innovations of early states was the concept of territorial jurisdiction. As kings extended authority beyond their city walls, they increasingly claimed rights over surrounding lands and their populations. This territorialization of power created new forms of identity. People began to think not only in terms of kinship and city affiliation, but also of allegiance to a named ruler and a defined realm. The material remains of boundary markers and administrative tablets remind us that territory was constantly negotiated. Governors were installed to oversee distant provinces, and tribute systems were set up to extract resources. At the same time, local customs and elites continued to hold sway, creating layered authorities within a single polity. Religion and kingship intertwined in public ritual that enacted territorial claims. Processions that carried cult statues through villages or along canals served to remind populations of both divine presence and royal reach. These rituals were performative acts of governance, persuading communities to accept distant authority as immediate reality. Kings and temples both invested in memory through libraries and archives. Clay tablets were stored in temple libraries alongside myths, hymns, and administrative records. These textual collections preserved knowledge across generations, enabling states to learn from the past, to model legal solutions, and to rehearse theological frameworks that supported governance. Education became a mechanism for social reproduction. Schools trained a class of scribes who inherited skills, codes of behavior, and professional networks. This literate class formed a backbone for administration, and their mobility, sometimes through royal patronage or trade networks, spread administrative practices across regions. The relationship between central authority and local governance was mediated by a web of officials and clients. Governors, city magistrates, and temple stewards implemented policies at the ground level, often balancing royal directives with local conditions. This decentralization allowed states to flexibly respond to varied environments, but it also created points of friction where corruption or resistance could emerge. Kings often legitimized their power through genealogical claims. They framed themselves as descendants of gods or legendary heroes, embedding their lineage within cosmologies that endowed their office with sacrosanct quality. Such genealogies mattered because they tied political continuity to a narrative of providential order. But lineage was only part of the story. Rulers also secured support through material generosity. Patronage, land grants, gifts of precious metals, and exemptions from labor drafts bound elites to the crown. These acts built networks of obligation that could be mobilized in times of crisis, turning private loyalty into public force. Rituals surrounding death and succession carried heavy political weight. The death of a king could trigger ceremonial rehearsals of power and sometimes violent contests over succession. To minimize instability, some regimes developed rules for heirship and ritualized kingship transfers, while others fell into cycles of usurpation that reshaped the political map. The physical artifacts of these transitions, funerary gifts, inscriptions commemorating reigns, and successions recorded in temple lists, offer insight into how ancient societies processed continuity and change. Monumental tombs and palace burials reflected the social standing of rulers and their desire for eternal presence. At the same time, the practicalities of succession often exposed the fragility of centralized authority. Diplomacy became a tool for preserving peace and expanding influence. Marriages between royal houses, exchange of gifts, and treaties of alliance created networks that mediated conflict. Diplomatic correspondence, preserved on clay tablets in later centuries, reveals a world where words could complement force and where reputation and protocol mattered greatly. Yet diplomacy had limits, and border disputes sometimes escalated into prolonged conflict. Because power was intimately bound to control over resources, water, arable land, trade routes, competition was persistent. War and alliance were therefore two sides of the same coin in a world where statehood depended on both protection and profit. The material culture of the king reinforced hierarchy in everyday life. Administrative seals, decorated robes, and palace spaces marked elites from ordinary citizens. Conversely, the architecture of common life, dense residential neighborhoods, communal ovens, and small courtyards, reveals how millions of people sustained urban economies through repetitive acts of production and consumption. Women played varied roles in this social and political tapestry. Some women rose to positions of substantial power as temple administrators, landowners, or even rulers. Others shaped household economies and local trade, and through marriage alliances they influenced wider political networks. Their agency often worked within patriarchal structures, but it could nevertheless be decisive in the shaping of policy and succession. Religion created specific avenues for female authority, since priestesses and temple managers could hold significant economic and ritual power. The temple household provided a sphere where women could manage property, oversee craft production, and participate in sacred rites. These roles complicated modern assumptions about the subordination of women in ancient societies. Economically, households were the unit of production and consumption, but their fortunes were tied to larger institutional frameworks. Taxes and labor obligations shaped household choices, while temple distributions and market access affected daily life. The interdependence of public institutions and private households made governance a matter of both macromanagement and micronegotiation. Markets and fairs were lively spaces where state policies met economic ingenuity. Merchants negotiated prices, craftsmen advertised wares, and standards of weights and measures established by authorities made trade possible across distances. These exchanges fueled urban life and provided the tangible flows of goods that sustained palace and temple alike. The connection between irrigation and power deserves particular emphasis. Control of water meant control of food, and irrigation systems, canals, dikes, and sluices were public goods requiring collective labor. The coordination of such systems is often cited as a driving force behind state formation because their maintenance required centralized planning and the ability to command seasonal labor. Yet environmental factors could also undermine state stability. Droughts, salinization of fields, and changing river courses could reduce agricultural yield, prompting migration, unrest, or political collapse. The oldest civilization was therefore always vulnerable to the same ecological contingencies that shape agrarian societies everywhere. Mortality and health also impacted political trajectories. Epidemics could depopulate labor pools and weaken imperial control, and chronic illnesses might devalue the labor of key populations. Public health was not an explicit ancient policy in the sense we know today, but clothing, diet, and urban conditions influenced the resilience of cities and their capacity for sustained governance. Religious reform and intellectual inquiry also marked periods of transformation. New cults arose, interpretations of orthodoxy shifted, and learned elites debated the nature of kingship and justice. These intellectual currents could legitimize innovations in governance or provide frameworks for resisting centralization, depending on the balance of forces in a given era. Cultural production, literature, monumental inscriptions, and hymns shaped the moral imagination of the polity. Epics that celebrated flood survival or heroic quests reinforced a shared identity, while didactic texts instructed officials and citizens in proper conduct. Cultural narratives thus served as soft power, aligning hearts and minds with the aims of statecraft. External contacts introduced new technologies and ideas. Contacts with distant lands brought metallurgy improvements, new crops, and different artistic motifs. These imports could have profound effects on local economies and military capabilities, sometimes intensifying competition and sometimes facilitating cooperation across larger regions. One of the most striking long-term consequences was the development of legal and administrative templates that survived across centuries. Even as empires rose and fell, institutions like temple administration, scribal schools, and standardized measures persisted, creating cultural continuity. Successive regimes inherited, adapted, and repurposed these tools as they sought legitimacy and efficiency. The rise and fall of dynasties highlighted the contingency of all political arrangements. A charismatic ruler might centralize power and leave lasting monuments, but infrastructure, elite coalitions, and economic networks determined whether such achievements endured. In many cases, the collapse of centralized authority led to a fragmentation that did not erase civilization but reconfigured its politics and economy. Archaeology and textual studies illuminate these patterns by triangulating physical remains, inscriptions, and later historiography. Excavated layers show cycles of building and abandonment, while written records provide narratives that often blended fact with royal ideology. Together, they allow us to reconstruct the texture of lives governed by kings and temples. Modern historians and archaeologists read these sources with an awareness of bias. Royal inscriptions proclaim victory and piety, often omitting failures and disasters. Temple records preserve financial transactions but rarely the voices of ordinary men and women. A careful reading therefore combines material evidence with textual critique to approach a fuller understanding. The study of the oldest civilization also compels us to reassess modern assumptions about the state. Early polities show that power can be embedded in ritual and economy as much as in coercion. They reveal the essential role of institutions that manage resources, fix time, and produce legitimacy, elements that continue to define political life today. As you listen, imagine the clatter of potter's wheels and the damp smell of river mud, the chants of priests at dawn and the clang of bronze in an armorer's workshop. Picture a city whose skyline is defined by a temple mound and a palace, where scribes press symbols into wet clay and merchants haggle over weights. Each sensory detail draws you closer to a world where kings and temples conversed in the language of power. That conversation was rarely static. It evolved in response to internal pressures and external shocks, to innovations in administration and to the shifting fortunes of trade. Over centuries, patterns of governance matured, producing both institutional stability and new vulnerabilities that shaped subsequent historical pathways. One of the enduring lessons from the oldest civilization is the interdependence of symbolic and material power. Kings built narratives and performed rites, but they also had to feed armies and support artisans. Temples maintained doctrine and ran granaries, and neither could sustain itself without the other. This mutual dependence created a political ecology in which multiple centers of power negotiated a settlement on how to govern. The oldest civilization left behind a legacy not only of monuments and tablets but of concepts, law, kingship, bureaucracy, and the idea that human communities could organize themselves on a large scale. These conceptual inheritances informed later empires and civilizations, weaving a longer story of human political development. The institutions that arose there were prototypes whose descendants echo through millennia. Yet for all their ingenuity, these societies were also human in their frailties, marked by ambition and cruelty, by ingenuity and error. They were patriarchal and hierarchical, creative and destructive, efficient in administration but often harsh in enforcement. Recognizing this complexity helps us avoid romanticizing the past while appreciating the deep human efforts to build durable order. Looking backward from our vantage, we can trace lines of continuity and rupture. Cities that once dazzled with ziggurats and palaces became ruins, their stories broken and resurrected by later generations of chroniclers and archaeologists. Those layers of history reveal how memory is curated, how triumphs are memorialized, and how defeats are sometimes erased or reinterpreted. The archaeology of the oldest civilization continues to surprise us with new findings that complicate old narratives. Each tablet and each excavated wall offers fresh angles on debates about state formation, economic coordination, and religious life. Scholars refine their models as evidence accumulates, and public interest keeps the conversation alive as part of a shared human inquiry. In classrooms and museums, the story of kings and temples is often told through spectacular artifacts, inscribed stelae, reliefs of conquest, and exquisite jewelry. These objects capture attention, but they are only part of a broader social fabric that included the quiet, repetitive labors of farmers, potters, and scribes. The state's grandeur rested on countless unseen acts, and acknowledging those acts deepens our appreciation of how societies functioned. The moral claims of ancient kingship were often bound up with promises of order, irrigation maintained, justice administered, enemies repelled. When those promises were honored, rulers gained loyalty. When they failed, legitimacy eroded. This pragmatic covenant between rulers and subjects is a theme that recurs across time and space, illustrating the fragile contract upon which power rests. Religious devotion served both as a genuine spiritual practice and as a mechanism of social cohesion. Participating in festivals and rituals forged communal bonds, turning disparate households into an urban community with shared obligations. In that sense, religion was an engine of governance, channeling emotions and commitments into collective action. The complexity of taxation and labor obligations shows that ancient states were adept managers as much as overlords. They deployed a variety of instruments, rations, corvée labor, temple service, to secure needed contributions without necessarily extracting them in a single form. This diversity of fiscal tools provided flexibility that helped polities adapt to changing economic circumstances. In moments of crisis, rulers had to persuade populations to bear burdens, and they used myths, propaganda, and material incentives to secure compliance. They retold origin stories of the city, invoked divine will, and distributed food and rewards to key supporters. These strategies were both political and psychological, aiming to sustain morale and institutional coherence. The archaeological record is also a record of resilience. Cities rebuilt after raids and floods, administrative systems adapted to new realities, and cultural forms persisted through adaptations. That resilience was not inevitable, it was the product of institutional creativity and human determination to preserve community amid adversity. As you imagine the long arc of history, consider the role of architecture not only in displaying power but in shaping daily life. Streets, markets, granaries, and workshops structured how people moved, worked, and worshipped. Urban design channeled social behavior and made public order both feasible and visible. Look also at the symbolic repertoire of kingship, titles that evoke shepherding or mastery of storm, images of rulers receiving symbols from the gods, and ritual objects that encapsulated authority. These symbols worked because they harnessed deep cultural meanings, images and phrases that resonated across social strata and anchored political speech in a shared symbolic universe. The oldest civilization also offers lessons in technological diffusion. Innovations in metallurgy, textile production, and administrative tools rippled outward, sometimes accelerating state projects and sometimes creating new dependencies. Technology mattered not merely for convenience but for its capacity to remake social relations and redistribute power. Another persistent theme is the role of memory in legitimating power. Temples and palaces stored the past in inscriptions and rituals, and rulers invoked that past to justify present actions. Historical narrative was thus both a record and an instrument. The writing of history often served the purposes of contemporary politics. Legal traditions carried forward moral expectations and enabled adjudication across disputes, which was essential for commercial life. Contractual forms, penalty schedules, and evidentiary practices provided a predictable framework for exchange, allowing trade to flourish even among strangers. Stability in law supported stability in commerce, which in turn supported political stability. But law also reflected social hierarchy. Penalties and protections often varied by status, and the law could reinforce inequality as much as mediate conflicts. Reading legal texts alongside archaeological data reveals how law both mirrored and structured social stratification. We mustn't forget the lived experience of urban commoners who navigated the demands of state while tending their households and neighborhoods. Their daily tactics, moving goods at market, forming mutual aid networks, negotiating with local officials, constituted the social infrastructure that allowed states to function. Understanding state power thus requires attention to the micro-level logistics of everyday life. As centuries turned, the oldest civilization influenced and was influenced by neighboring cultures. Cross-cultural exchange reshaped religious practices, language, and economic habits, producing hybrid forms that endured. This ongoing dialogue created a culturally rich and politically dynamic environment in which the idea of the state continued to evolve. Finally, the archaeology of kings and temples invites us to reflect on continuity and change. Structures crumble, dynasties end, and languages shift, but certain institutional logics persist. The strategies of resource mobilization, the sacralization of authority, and the use of written records to manage society are patterns that resonate across history, reminding us that many of our political tools have very ancient roots. As the narrative of the oldest civilization concludes for now, it leaves behind not a tidy ending but a set of enduring questions. How do communities balance coercion and consent? How do leaders persuade subjects to carry burdens? What does legitimacy require when survival itself depends on complex institutions? These questions were negotiated long ago beneath the dust of temple courts and palace halls, and their echoes shape modern thought about power and governance. Even as we draw together the threads of kingship, temple economy, and state formation, the story remains open-ended. Archaeologists will uncover more tablets and scholars will refine interpretations. The past will continue to talk to us in new voices. Listening closely, we can hear the ancient conversation about how human beings organized themselves, and perhaps learn something about our own political arrangements from the strategies they developed, the mistakes they made, and the institutions they left behind. Long before maps were drawn the way we know them, there was a river and a people who learned to bend it to their will. This is where our story begins, in the soft, fertile sweep between rivers where the soil remembers footsteps. They called themselves many names over the centuries, and later historians called them by one of the oldest names we can read, the Sumerians. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by water, and out of that rhythm grew trade, warfare, and the first shoots of empire. The first market stalls did not appear out of political designs, but out of necessity. Surplus grain and crafted goods had to find hands beyond the family plot. That need created pathways, paths became tracks, and tracks became a network that bound villages to towns and towns to distant cities. Trade was the engine that pushed people out of their fields and into contact with others, and that contact would change everything. A merchant leaving a walled town carried more than barley. He carried stories of weather, of styles, and of weapons. Objects moved faster than ideas at first, but every object that changed hands brought with it a new technique, a new possibility, a new reason for cities to strengthen their walls. Trade created wealth, and wealth required protection, so the work of merchants and the work of soldiers began to shadow one another. In those earliest centuries, wealth took simple forms: grain stored in clay jars, wool woven into practical cloth, copper hammered into small tools. The first long-distance trade was clumsy by later standards: donkeys and boats, baskets and simple accounting tokens. But what was clumsy held power, because even a simple bronze axe could reshape lives, and even a string of beads could signal alliance across 100 miles. The rivers themselves were highways. Flat-bottomed boats cut through reeds and current and carried timber, stone, and grain from one delta to another. Where the water stopped, overland caravans picked up cargo and continued, and so the economy became a patchwork of modalities that demanded coordination. Cities became nodes in a growing web, and rulers learned that controlling nodes meant controlling more than just taxes. Control required ideology as much as armies. Leaders framed their authority with stories of gods who favored them, with building projects that would be remembered, and with legal codes that made commerce predictable. Predictability mattered. A contract written on a clay tablet had weight when future transactions relied upon reputation. In this way, law and temple, trade and faith, braided together into a social fabric strong enough to bear complexity. As commerce expanded, so did the range of materials in circulation. Copper from mountain veins, lapis lazuli ground into powder, tin brought from far-off lands to hardened bronze, each material bore a different geography. That geography stitched distant regions together, because no single place held everything necessary for an advanced craft. Dependence on distant resources fostered diplomatic ties and occasional rivalry, and it was in those tensions that warfare found its opening. Early warfare was not always the grand spectacle of later epics. It often began as raiding and retaliation over grazing land, water rights, and stolen herds. Yet as cities accumulated wealth and stored grain, the scale of violence shifted. Defensive architecture grew grander, siege techniques slowly evolved, and the line between a fortified town and a fortress blurred into one unbroken defense line along key routes. The technology of war tracked the technology of trade and craft. Bronze weapons required copper and tin and skilled smiths, and those smiths were worth protecting because their work changed the odds on a battlefield. Armor and chariots transformed skirmishes into organized confrontations, and with organization came logistics, supply chains, forward bases, and the first professional soldiers paid in rations and social standing. As leaders sought to stabilize routes and secure supply lines, they turned outward. Expansion became a strategy not only of ambition but of survival. If your city relied on timber from afar, then planting a garrison near the forest or a port became a reasonable insurance policy. Thus trade and imperial expansion were not separate paths but a single spiral, each turn outward fed the next. Empires in the ancient world rarely resembled modern nation-states. They were loose aggregates of cities, subject towns, and tribute-paying regions held together by networks of loyalty. The capital might command tribute and offer protection, but it rarely had the bureaucratic reach to micromanage distant villages. This gave rise to a hybrid governance, where local rulers kept autonomy in exchange for soldiers, grain, or loyalty to the central sacral king. To maintain such empires, communication mattered. Messengers and mounted couriers cut days from decision-making and made coordinated military campaigns possible. With written systems came even greater coherence. Administrative tablets, sealed jars, and lists of rations allowed kings to track resources across dozens of sites. The ability to count and to record became a secret strength, one as crucial as any fortification. Trade routes were arteries that fed empires, and choke points along those arteries were highly contested. Narrow river mouths, mountain passes, and desert oases became natural toll points and places for fortification. Whoever controlled those points could tax commerce or deny it, and as a result, many early conflicts were about locks on movement rather than the conquest of distant lands. Maritime trade introduced a new dimension. Coastal cities developed shipwrights who learned how to shape sturdier hulls and use sails to harness the wind. Sea lanes connected civilizations across open water, bringing exotic goods and new ideas. The sea was both a connector and a hazard, forcing cities to invest in dockyards, naval patrols, and treaties with maritime neighbors. Treaties emerged from mutual need as much as from respect. Maritime powers struck accords to prevent piracy and to standardize weights and measures so that a merchant from one city could buy without being cheated in another. Those standards created shared expectations and lowered the cost of doing business across regions. They were the precursors of more formalized legal frameworks that later empires would codify. Yet agreements could be fragile. When a drought or a poor harvest tightened resources, the calculus of cooperation quickly changed. Starvation and scarcity intensified competition and could push diplomacy into war. Leaders who had previously traded grain for timber sometimes found themselves besieged because the neighbor they relied upon could not deliver. Warfare evolved as a response to both opportunity and constraint. A military expedition could be a way to secure a new source of timber, to seize a fertile plain, or to force a trade monopoly. As battles scaled up, commanders learned tactics meant to disrupt supply lines, capture granaries, and control rivers. Logistics, the hidden art of feeding armies, became a decisive factor in long campaigns. Fortress towns were not only military assets but also economic centers. They housed workshops and markets and became magnets for artisans whose goods were needed for war and daily life alike. A besieged fortress could survive on stored supplies for months if it was well provisioned, turning sieges into wars of attrition that favored the better organized state. The role of religion in these conflicts cannot be understated. Temples often sponsored trade, manufactured goods, and even maintained archives that preserved techniques and contracts. Temples sometimes funded military expeditions and at other times served as negotiated neutral ground for treaties. Sacred authority gave rulers a theological legitimacy that smoothed over the raw edges of power. As empires grew, administrative complexity required novel institutions. Specialized scribes and bureaucrats emerged to manage grain distributions, labor drafts, and tribute lists. The presence of a trained administrative class allowed rulers to plan multi-year campaigns and to maintain far-flung garrisons. That planning, in turn, made territorial control more sustainable. Competition among cities encouraged innovations in statecraft as much as in weapons. Some rulers invested in infrastructure, canals, roads, and storerooms that eased the movement of goods and soldiers. Others relied on marriages, gifts, and intermarriage among elite families to build networks of loyalty that could cross cultural lines. Soft power and hard power thus interwove in the making of early empires. Trade demanded security, and security demanded money. Tribute systems evolved into more formal taxation mechanisms that provided predictable revenue. With steady income, rulers could maintain larger standing forces, sponsor monumental building projects, and support artistic production that communicated their greatness. Monuments were both statements of power and assets in a competitive landscape of symbolic capital. The manufacture of prestige goods became an industry tightly linked to imperial status. Intricate jewelry, carved ivory, and finely painted ceramics were not just luxuries, they were diplomatic currency, exchanged at courts and used to cement alliances. Possessing these goods signaled access to distant resources and skilled labor, which in turn underscored a ruler's capacity to command resources. As cities grew into centers of specialized production, artisans formed guild-like groups, passing down techniques through apprenticeships. The transmission of craft knowledge was essential for equipping both trade networks and military forces. The better an empire could produce tools, clothing, and arms, the more it could project power and stabilize its economy. Rulers sometimes attempted to control the production of certain commodities by state monopolies. Controlling the smelting of bronze, the weaving of textiles, or the distribution of rare minerals gave the elite leverage over both domestic and foreign actors. Monopolies were fragile, however, because artisans could migrate and merchants could build new routes when old ones were taxed or restricted. The raw materials themselves shaped geopolitics. Regions rich in copper or tin became targets for alliances and raids, while fertile river valleys produced surpluses that funded expansion. Environmental constraints, like deforestation or salinization of fields, also forced states to adapt or contract. The interplay between ecology and empire meant that resource management was always political and often contested. Information was a commodity. Spies, scouts, and networks of informants told rulers when a caravan was coming, when an ally might be wavering, or when a distant harvest failed. Intelligence allowed empires to intercept trade, to preempt rebellions, and to time campaigns during seasons of least resistance. Knowledge of terrain and of seasonal patterns gave tactical advantages that could decide wars. The role of roads and canals cannot be overstated in this era of expansion. A well-built road could shave days off a journey and allow armies to move with relative speed. Canals linked watersheds and brought agricultural productivity that could support larger urban populations. Infrastructure investments were, therefore, investments in both commerce and the ability to levy and move troops. As cities became ever more interconnected, cultural exchange accelerated. Scripts and languages spread along trade routes, bringing new administrative techniques and religious ideas. Artistic motifs traveled on pottery and textiles and were often repurposed into local styles that signaled both assimilation and distinct identity. Cultural hybridity became a hallmark of interconnected empires. Migration of peoples, whether voluntary or forced, altered demographics and labor markets. Refugees, artisans, and captives brought skills and also new tensions. The movement of populations could fill labor shortages in some regions while causing social strain in others, which sometimes precipitated new laws regulating movement and labor. Diplomacy took on ritualized forms as empires learned that face-to-face exchanges of gifts, hostages, and marriages could be more effective than endless warfare. Envoys were trained to understand the etiquette of foreign courts and to carry the correct symbols of prestige. These rituals prevented conflicts by embedding predictable patterns of interaction between competing centers of power. Yet rituals could break down under stress. When expectations failed or insults occurred, what had been a ritual exchange could turn into provocation. The slightest rumor of a betrayal could cascade into military mobilization, because honor and reputation were essential currencies in a world where visible strength discouraged predation. Thus, the symbolic economy had real, often violent consequences. Military technology progressed unevenly across regions. Some areas prioritized chariots and composite bows, others refined infantry tactics and fortification design. Innovations tended to diffuse through trade and captured artisans. A smith taken in war might teach his captors new techniques that shifted the balance of power. The capture and relocation of skill was therefore as important as the capture of territory. The logistics of maintaining empires introduced bureaucratic innovations that later societies would systematize. Rulers developed calendars for planting and taxation cycles, standardized weights for trade, and record-keeping systems to manage labor. Such systems reduced uncertainty and allowed states to plan military campaigns that depended on the synchronized contribution of distant provinces. Sometimes empires collapsed under their own weight. Overextension without adequate administrative capacity created rebellious margins that eroded legitimacy. A failed harvest, a plague, or an invasion could trigger a chain reaction of secession and economic collapse. In many cases, successor states rose from the fragments and inherited the infrastructure, trade routes, and sometimes the ruling class of the vanquished. Yet collapse was rarely absolute. Trade networks often proved more resilient than political boundaries. Merchants continued to move goods across former imperial borders, and former capitals sometimes rebounded as regional centers under new leadership. The persistence of commerce across political rupture shows how deeply economic ties had become embedded in daily life. In the centuries that followed, empires learned to institutionalize many of the successes and failures of their predecessors. Military logistics were formalized, taxation systems became more regular, and centralized recruitment for armies started to replace ad hoc levies. The experience of earlier state failures informed the legal and administrative reforms that made later empires more durable. The expansion of early empires was also shaped by ideology. Kingship was often framed as a cosmic order, a necessary alignment of heaven and earth to ensure fertility and balance. This made rebellion not merely a political act but a theological transgression in the eyes of many. Sacred kingship could therefore legitimize extraordinary demands on populations, such as labor drafts for monumental projects. Monumental architecture served multiple purposes. It demonstrated capacity, employed labor, and acted as a visible promise of order. Temples and palaces were centers of storage and administration as well as worship. Their visibility served as a deterrent to would-be rivals and as a magnet for artisan labor, which in turn supported trade in luxury goods that reinforced elite status. Trade networks also promoted technological cross-pollination. The wheel, metallurgy, textile dyeing techniques, and even methods of irrigation spread outward from their points of origin. Each technological adoption reduced the cost of production or transport, which in turn expanded markets and encouraged further specialization. Technology thus functioned as both a cause and consequence of imperial growth. Slave labor formed part of the economic base in many of these early empires, though its scale and form varied widely. Captives from warfare were often pressed into service on construction projects or as household labor in elite homes. The use of forced labor created social tensions and moral questions that elites sometimes tried to reconcile through ideology or legal codes that sought to regulate treatment and duty. The economic impact of warfare was complex. While war could route resources toward military production and create opportunities for plunder and redistribution, it also disrupted production and trade. Long campaigns drained treasuries and could depopulate regions through conscription and attrition. Smart rulers had to weigh the immediate gains of conquest against the long-term cost of maintaining overextended supply lines. In response, many states developed flexible modes of governance that blended coercion with incentives. Some regions were integrated by offering local elites a stake in the imperial economy, land grants, positions in the bureaucracy, or permission to continue local customs in exchange for taxes and troops. This co-optation was often more stable than direct rule because it exploited existing social structures. The role of women in trade and diplomacy has too often been overlooked, but women frequently managed households that included small workshops and participated in local markets. Elite women in many courts acted as bargaining chips in marriage alliances and sometimes served as regents or patrons of trade. Their economic and social influence could knit together families and regions in ways that formal politics could not. As literacy spread among administrative classes, the written word became an instrument of power. Contracts, treaties, and royal decrees were recorded so that a later contest over rights could point to an earlier, authoritative text. The archival impulse preserved knowledge about taxes, landholding, and trade privileges which could be mobilized by successors and challengers alike. Environmental change played a dramatic role in shaping the trajectories of these early civilizations. Periods of drought, soil exhaustion, or rising salinity in irrigated lands could reduce yields and force migration. Elites who failed to respond with adaptations in irrigation or crop selection faced unrest and decline. In this way, environmental stewardship became a political duty. Mercantile networks adapted to these shifts by finding alternative suppliers or rerouting trade through more reliable corridors. Merchants who had cultivated relationships across many regions could pivot when one source failed, and those networks often became the backbone of post-collapse recovery. The resilience of trade was thus a key offset to famine and political fragmentation. The archaeological record shows that cities were cosmopolitan hubs where languages and goods were as likely to mix as to clash. Pottery from one coast appears in sites hundreds of miles away, and burial goods reveal hybrid styles that speak to shared aesthetic tastes. Such blending shows how trade fomented cultural creativity that transcended political borders. Currency systems evolved to facilitate these expanding economies. Initially, barter and commodity exchange dominated, but over time standardized weights and units and eventually minted coinage made transactions more efficient. Coinage simplified taxation and soldier payment and created a visible symbol of sovereign authority that circulated across regions. The moral economy of early empires, the expectations about fairness, debt, and redistribution, shaped social stability. Rulers who were seen as hoarding wealth or failing to provide for their subjects risked unrest. Those who distributed resources during famine or crisis could solidify loyalty. This reciprocal expectation between ruler and ruled underpinned many social contracts in the ancient world. Technological improvement in transport, like better saddles and hull designs, allowed longer routes and heavier loads, increasing the profitability of long-distance trade. As profitability grew, so did market specialization, and entire towns could become known for pottery, metalwork, or textiles, producing at scales that required coordination and governance. This economic specialization encouraged urbanization and fed imperial centers with both goods and people. Empires that mastered both coercive and cooperative strategies tended to last longer. Military strength deterred predation and rebellion, while institutional incentives created buy-in among subjugated elites. Successful rulers thus balanced force with negotiation, sometimes granting privileges to ensure supply lines and sometimes resorting to punitive expeditions to signal consequences for defection. Cross-cultural marriages and diplomatic exchanges often introduced new production techniques and commodities into imperial economies. A princess sent as part of an alliance might bring court tastes that elevated a craft and created new markets. In that way, personal relationships could have macroeconomic consequences that reshaped trade patterns and artistic preferences. The interplay of peripheral regions and imperial centers was dynamic. Borderlands were not merely passive recipients of policy but active producers of innovation and resistance. Frontier societies sometimes hybridized administrative practices, blending central decrees with local customs to produce governance models that were more responsive. These adaptations, when successful, could be exported back to imperial centers to inform broader reform. Population movements induced by imperial campaigns or economic opportunity reconfigured labor and consumption patterns. Migrant artisans set up workshops in new cities, transferring skills and creating new economic niches. Such movements could seed rapid urban growth in formerly quiet locales, converting them into strategic waypoints for both commerce and military logistics. Over time, legal codes developed to regulate economic life more tightly. Laws govern contracts, property rights, inheritance, and commercial disputes, reducing transaction costs and bolstering confidence in long-distance trade. A predictable legal environment encouraged investment in production techniques and in merchant fleets, both of which magnified an empire's economic reach. The role of the military in administration grew as empires professionalized their forces. Soldiers sent to distant garrisons sometimes settled there, marrying local women and integrating into regional societies. These soldier settlers could become a stabilizing force that defended trade and enforced tax collection, melding military service with frontier colonization. Tax farming and delegated revenue collection were pragmatic solutions to the administrative limits of central governments. By leasing the right to collect taxes to contractors, rulers secured immediate revenue, though they risked corruption and exploitation that could spur rebellion. Over time, the need to balance short-term funds with long-term stability shaped fiscal institutions. Maritime empires developed navies not only to fight but to escort merchant convoys and to suppress piracy. A secure sea lane increased trade volume and reduced insurance-like costs for merchants, incentivizing more regular voyages. Naval power thus became an economic tool as much as a military one, protecting the flow of goods essential for imperial prosperity. The narratives of imperial expansion often obscured the agency of smaller polities and merchant groups who negotiated the terms of inclusion. Local leaders sometimes played larger powers against one another to secure favorable terms, and merchants could leverage their mobility to escape heavy-handed control. This constant bargaining suggests that empire was often less monolithic and more negotiated than its monuments imply. The accumulation of knowledge, agricultural, metallurgical, administrative, was a slow but decisive engine of power. Libraries of administrative tablets and compendia of agricultural techniques allowed states to reproduce successful practices across generations. Investment in knowledge transmission proved as important as investment in walls or weapons for long-term stability. Over centuries, as empires rose and fell, trade networks adapted and often expanded beyond the memory of their founders. New corridors emerged, old ones shifted, and whole economies recalibrated to new patterns of demand. The continuous adaptation of trade and the concurrent professionalization of warfare were twin processes that shaped the human geography of the ancient world. The story of the oldest civilization and its successors is thus a story of interdependence, between fields and armies, between merchants and kings, between artisans and architects. Trade created wealth that demanded protection, and warfare created the need for resources that trade alone could supply. Expansion was both a method of survival and a spectacle of ambition, and its legacy is the complex map of culture, power, and exchange we inherit today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a river that moves like a long, slow knife through golden grass, feeding a plain that smells faintly of salt and reeds and fresh mud. That plain is where human beings first learned to gather themselves into cities, where the long experiment of civilization began and from which the rest of the world would borrow, steal, and adapt those earliest blueprints. The oldest civilizations rose not from some sudden miracle but from 1,000 small decisions about when to plant, how to build, and how to share the harvest. The cradle of this first civilization lay between two rivers, the great Tigris and the broad Euphrates, in a landscape we now call Mesopotamia, meaning between rivers. It was a place of extremes, where flood and drought coexisted in the same year and where the soil could be bewilderingly generous if shepherded correctly. People learned to canalize water, to watch the skies, and to read the cycles of the seasons, turning unpredictable nature into a calculable resource. From those tentative beginnings came villages that swelled into towns and towns that clustered into the first city-states. Cities such as Eridu, often called by later scribes the place where kingship descended from heaven, and Uruk, which in time grew into a metropolis so large it blurred the line between human plan and living organism. Each city was a compact world of mud brick houses, narrow alleys, public temples, and marketplaces humming with trade and gossip. Think of the mud brick walls, thick, warm, and very often the color of sun-baked bread. Building with mud was practical and beautiful in its own way, a tactile architecture that matched the landscape. Roofs were flat and used as extensions of living space, while doorways framed the daily comings and goings of families, craftspeople, and priests who regulated both water and law. In these cities, religion and governance were intertwined from the start, and the temple became the heart of civic life. Temples were not simply places of worship but centers of storage and redistribution, where grain and livestock were counted, stamped, and sent on to feed the city and its labor force. Priests were managers of abundance and wickedly practical about measurements, insisting on standardized measures and meticulous records to prevent fraud and maintain the social order. The need to record ownership and transactions pushed people into writing, and what took shape in clay at the edge of the rivers was the world's first script. Early marks began as simple impressions to represent quantities and goods, but over generations those impressions evolved into wedge-shaped signs pressed by a reed stylus, cuneiform. Clay tablets, once soft and moist, were baked either by accident in fires or deliberately, and in them the daily reality of ancient life became durable. In the scriptorium, or adubba as the scribal house was called, children learned the hard geometry of the reed stylus. School life combined rote repetition with ritual discipline, as apprentices copied lists and proverbs, practiced numerical tables, and memorized myths. This education produced a class of literate bureaucrats who could read contracts, record legal disputes, and send dispatches across distances that otherwise would have been impossible to manage. The first stories written in cuneiform were often practical: lists of rations, inventories of animals, receipts for barley, records of land sales. But alongside those dry administrative texts flowered hymns, laments, riddles, and the earliest myths of creation and flood. The same clay that kept track of grain also preserved the names of gods, the deeds of kings, and the private griefs of ordinary people who left messages to their descendants carved in wedge marks. Kingship itself took a remarkable form in this earliest civilization. Rulers were presented as chosen by the gods, yet they were also craftsmen of peace and war, builders of canals and fortresses, negotiators of trade, and servants to the divine order. Because the task of managing water systems required cooperation and coordination, the authority of kings often rested upon demonstrable achievements: a new canal, a restored dike, a successful campaign that secured trade routes. City-states competed fiercely, but they also copied one another, borrowing gods, names, architectural forms, and administrative practices. This cultural replication created a recognizable Mesopotamian world, a shared set of symbols and ideas that stretched across the plain despite political fragmentation. It was a civilization of familiar conversations and rivalries, where a temple hymn could be sung in many dialects and where the same seal might be used to secure merchants' goods from one end of the region to the other. Trade transformed these city-states into hubs of exchange. Craft specialization emerged as artisans focused on textiles, metalwork, pottery, and the exquisite little objects known as cylinder seals. These seals, engraved with scenes of gods, heroes, and everyday life, were rolled over wet clay to sign documents and protect goods. Each seal was both a personal signature and a tiny work of art, giving a unique imprint to contracts and letters. Metallurgy and craft advanced hand in hand with trade. Copper was hammered into tools and weapons, and later bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, became a symbol of increased sophistication. The procurement of tin, usually from distant sources, required long-distance connections and sturdy boats that plied the Persian Gulf and the rivers. The wheel, which first appears in pottery and later in transport, began to reshape mobility and logistics, allowing heavier loads to be moved more efficiently across plains and along roads. Alongside technological progress grew the first coherent legal systems. Records show disputes resolved in courts and judgments that were written down, establishing precedents for fairness and responsibility. These early laws balanced private rights with communal needs. They dealt with loans and debt, property boundaries, marriage contracts, and penalties for theft. Although sometimes harsh by modern sensibilities, those laws brought a kind of predictability to social life that was essential for markets and civic enterprise. Religion in this civilization was capacious and imaginative, populated by a pantheon of gods who were themselves extensions of the forces people felt at work around them. Enlil had power over air and storm, Enki was the clever deity of water and craft, Inanna embodied love and war with fierce contradictions, and Shamash was the eye of justice and light. Temples dedicated to these gods dominated city skylines, their stepped ziggurats raising the sacred into the heavens as if to bridge human needs with divine will. Ritual and myth functioned as social glue. Myths explained the world and justified rulers, while ritual conveyed a sense of continuity from generation to generation. Festivals brought the city together, with processions, animal sacrifices, offerings of grain, and theatrical reenactments of mythic events that reminded people of their place within a cosmic order. These communal practices bound the populace to the temple economy, reinforcing the authority of priests and kings alike. Among the most powerful of the early cities was Uruk, a sprawling urban center with monumental public projects and a population that may have reached into the tens of thousands. Uruk is often credited with birthing many of the defining features of urban civilization: large-scale construction, a professional class of priests and administrators, and a complex economy that required deep record-keeping. The city's public architecture, which included vast platforms and temples, suggested an ambition to centralize religious and economic life at a previously unseen scale. The kings of Uruk and other cities sometimes found glory in military conquest, and here too the lines between legend and history blurred delightfully. Heroes and rulers were celebrated on monuments and in long poems that hailed their victories and lamented their losses. These epics were not mere entertainment, they were civic education, stories that taught ideals of leadership, bravery, piety, and the cost of hubris. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which survives in fragments and later compilations, gives us a particularly intimate portrait of the age, a hero king who is at once mighty and flawed, seeking immortality and finding instead the wisdom to accept limitation. Gilgamesh's journey takes him through storms of grief, encounters with acute cruelty and profound compassion, and a final recognition of the importance of human ties and the work one leaves behind. The poem speaks not just for rulers but for a broad human longing that is strikingly familiar to listeners across millennia. The world of the earliest civilization was not homogeneous. It contained a web of languages and dialects, and it was always in motion as people moved for work, for trade, or as captives in the turmoil of war. The Akkadian language would rise to prominence as a lingua franca, absorbing Sumerian into its fold and making possible the transmission of administrative techniques and literary forms. Language became another vehicle for culture to travel, adapt, and endure. Political change arrives in cycles, and no city-state remained dominant forever. The rise of Sargon of Akkad in the 3rd millennium BCE is one of the first fully attested stories of imperial ambition. Sargon consolidated multiple cities into an empire, sending administrators to govern in his stead and establishing a template for imperial rule. His regime propagated bureaucratic methods and cosmopolitan exchange, though it could not permanently abolish the more localized loyalties that sustained city life. Empire reshaped trade networks, attracting artisans and merchants to new centers of demand while transferring goods and ideas across long distances. Luxury items, lapis lazuli, silver, exotic woods, moved across miles, their value amplified by the labor and political connections that brought them into the cities. It is in part because of this voracious appetite for foreign goods that Mesopotamian influence extended to distant shores, eventually touching Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, and beyond. Amidst the heights of political ambition and economic specialization, human life remained anchored in ordinary routines that necessarily continued from one age to another. People rose with the sun, replanted fields, mended pottery, spun wool in courtyards, and tended to children. Domestic life created a rhythm of work and concern that no palace could fully command, and on clay tablets we sometimes catch the private voice, a husband's request, a mother's lament, a merchant's calculation. Gender roles were complex and varied, with women participating in economic and religious activities while also often responsible for households. Some women served as high-ranking priestesses who commanded significant authority and resources, while others labored as weavers, sellers of bread, or agricultural laborers. The archaeological record and the texts together paint a nuanced picture. Women were neither wholly constrained nor uniformly empowered, but lived across a spectrum shaped by class, family, and local custom. Slavery existed in this ancient society, but it did not always fit later expectations of lifelong bondage or absolute dispossession. People could become slaves due to debt, capture, or legal punishment, and sometimes they could buy their freedom or secure release through family networks. Nonetheless, the presence of unfree labor shaped parts of the economy and social hierarchy and must be understood as part of the larger system of production and control. Science and measurement took early root in the practical demands of agriculture, architecture, and accounting. The sexagesimal system, based on 60, found application in calculations of time and geometry, and it still shapes our division of hours and degrees today. Surveyors measured fields with ropes and stakes, determining property lines and resolving disputes with the same geometric instincts that would later influence Greek mathematics. Astronomy sprouted from practical skywatching and ritual requirements, as priests kept track of celestial patterns to time festivals and agricultural operations. Observations of the moon and stars were formalized into cycles and calendars, and while their cosmology blended religious meaning with empirical observation, the predictive aspects of their astronomy were neither trivial nor purely symbolic. Charts and records allowed them to predict certain recurring phenomena with a precision that astonished later observers. Art in the earliest civilization was multifaceted, combining utility with a sense of the sublime. Reliefs carved into stone celebrated rulers' victories and mythic scenes, while inlaid mosaics composed of shell and lapis created luminous surfaces that caught the light of temple halls. Small figurines, beautifully made jewelry, and finely cut pottery reveal a taste for detail and a commitment to craft that persisted across generations. Music and poetry were woven into religious and secular life, played on harps and lyres, and sung in marking the rhythms of daytime and season. Musicians accompanied rituals, accompanied lovers' songs in private courtyards, and provided a soundtrack to civic ceremony. Though much of the music itself is lost, instruments and references in texts let us imagine melodies that punctuated both festival and funeral. Possibly the most remarkable feature of this civilization is how it organized knowledge. Lists of terms, lexical compilations, and multilingual tablets show an archival zeal. Priests and scholars painstakingly copied words and their equivalents in multiple languages to preserve meaning across generations. This institutional memory became a repository of technique and tradition, ensuring that the practices of administration, law, and ritual could endure even when kings and empires fell. Famine, drought, and the slow creep of salinity into the soil were constant threats to agricultural productivity. Irrigation, while necessary for success, came with unintended consequences. Poor drainage and the accumulation of salts made some fields less fertile over time. Environmental pressures required technical innovation and social adaptation, and at times they contributed to political instability as people clamored for relief or blamed rulers for failing to manage the land. The landscape itself held a narrative of human intervention, a palimpsest of canals, raised fields, and abandoned settlements. Archaeology shows patterns of settlement expansion and decline, the fingerprint of cities waxing and waning as watercourses shifted and political fortunes turned. These long environmental arcs remind us that civilization was always a negotiation with place, a constant adjustment to conditions mutable and severe. Conquest and assimilation blurred cultural boundaries. The Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian periods each added layers to the civilization, sometimes burying older languages and sometimes preserving them through bilingual inscriptions. Royal inscriptions boasted of victories and building projects, but above all they sought to present the ruler as the guarantor of order, someone who maintained roads, temples, and grain stores so that commerce and worship could continue. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone centuries later, encapsulates a long-standing concern with justice and social regulation. It is famous and illuminating because it preserves a legal mind that calibrated punishment to crime, differentiated penalties by class, and sought to deter violence through clear rules. While not the first legal code, it crystallizes the idea that law could be written, displayed, and appealed to, an idea that echoes down through subsequent legal traditions. Yet civilization was not only laws and temples. It was also the small, fragile intimacies of life made visible in grave goods, letters, and household items. In burial chambers like those found in UR, the richness of personal expression becomes apparent. Musicians, attendants, jewelry, and offerings placed with the deceased point to beliefs about the afterlife and the desire to continue status beyond death. The material culture around death tells us about status, fear, hope, and the enduring wish to be remembered. Excavation brought these buried worlds back into light and created a new kind of story in our own time. The digs at UR, led by archaeologists in the early 20th century, revealed royal tombs full of gold, beadwork, and the standard of war and peace. Those finds captivated public imagination, showing vividly that the people of the earliest civilization had worries, splendors, and ambitions comparable in depth to any modern society. The clay tablets recovered from ancient archives were the real treasures for scholarship because they allowed voices from the past to speak directly again. The process of decipherment took patience and comparative linguistics, with scholars slowly unlocking cuneiform signs and reconstructing languages that had been silent for centuries. Each decipherment recovered a message, a contract, a hymn, a recipe, a school exercise, bringing ancient everyday life into unexpectedly close conversation with us. Decipherment was not only a technical triumph but also a cultural revolution. Once cuneiform yielded its secrets, historians could trace legal formulas, mythic narratives, and administrative methods across time. The flood tale found in a much later Assyrian tablet, strikingly similar to stories in other traditions, revealed the way stories migrated and transformed across regions and epochs. This discovery urged scholars to rethink how myths travel and survive. As the age of cities matured and then shifted, new powers rose to take advantage of established networks. The Assyrians built a more militarized state with efficient logistics, intense siege warfare, and an imperial ideology that demanded tribute and loyalty. Their art recorded campaigns with brutal clarity, and their administrative craft perfected a system of provincial governance that could manage diverse peoples under one authority. Even after political domination changed hands, the cultural legacy of the earliest civilization persisted. The Babylonians, inheritors of many earlier practices, became famous for their astronomy, their libraries, and their legal wisdom. The narrative of a civilization that first learned to write, to measure, and to govern continued to influence neighboring cultures and, eventually, the Mediterranean world. Contact with the wider ancient world, including the Levant and Anatolia, created dialogues that reshaped religious and literary traditions. Stories migrated with merchants and migrants, sometimes fused with local myths, producing new syncretic forms. The intellectual tools developed in Mesopotamia, writing, law, astronomy, were adaptable technologies that could be remade in new contexts while retaining traces of their original logic. The fall of city-states often came through a mixture of internal strain and external pressure. Attempts to centralize control sometimes undermined local initiative, and prolonged warfare drained treasuries and ruined irrigation works. Invasions from neighboring peoples, including the Elamites and later Indo-European groups, contributed to political transformation, but the underlying infrastructural and cultural templates lived on in the forms of institutions and texts. When the Persians and, later, the Greeks under Alexander looked upon Mesopotamia, they found a near-mythic landscape of ruined ziggurats and functioning administrative traditions. Some conquerors sought to learn from native administrators, incorporating local scribes into their governance, while others transplanted Hellenic institutions on top of older frameworks. What mattered most for posterity was that the techniques of record-keeping, law, and urban management outlived the particular rulers who once wielded them. For millennia, the material remains of the earliest civilization were distributed across museums and collections, provoking admiration and sometimes controversy. Objects excavated decades ago now sit behind glass, their origins refracted by colonial histories and contemporary debates over cultural heritage. Conversations about repatriation and rightful ownership continue in the present, complicating our relationship with the past and asking hard questions about who gets to hold memory. Modern archaeology has refined its methods, moving from treasure hunting to careful stratigraphic excavation and scientific analysis. Radiocarbon dating, soil analysis, and a host of techniques allow us to reconstruct diets, migration patterns, and climate changes with greater precision. These technical advances have deepened our empathy for ancient people by revealing the nuances of their lives, what they ate, what diseases they faced, how they organized labor. Our understanding of the earliest civilization is also shaped by literary imagination in the modern world. Writers, poets, and filmmakers have looked to the river plains for inspiration, translating the imagery of lyres, ziggurats, and reed boats into new narratives that resonate with contemporary concerns about power and vulnerability. These creative reframings, while sometimes romanticized, keep the conversation alive between modern listeners and ancient inhabitants. Education about the world's first civilization matters because it reminds us that many features we take for granted, urban life, written law, complex economies, have deep antecedents. Our own civic forms did not arise in isolation. They are layered, borrowed, and often adapted from earlier experiments in how to live together. Recognizing this lineage can change how we think about contemporary institutions and the fragile scaffolding that supports them. The legacy of the earliest civilization manifests in unexpected ways, in our division of hours, in the concept of legal codes, in the very idea that scribes and scholars can preserve knowledge across generations. It is a legacy of techniques more than a single culture, a set of practices and discoveries that became part of human toolkit. The survival of these tools, writing, measurement, administration, shaped the trajectory of human history in ways both practical and profound. In retracing that history, we also encounter humility. The same ingenuity that built canals and cities also created problems that challenged rulers and ordinary people alike: salinized fields, social inequalities, and the need to balance local autonomy with centralized management. There is a perennial tension between innovation and its consequences, a rhythm of creation and correction that civilizations have been repeating ever since. To listen to the layers of this past is to hear many voices. There are the lofty hymns of priests, the pragmatic notes of merchants, the plaintive lines of love poetry, and the bureaucrats' dry ledgers. Each voice contributes to a chorus that, together, makes the ancient plain into a living place rather than an abstract idea. The humanity of those voices is startling. Their concerns are startlingly like ours. Museum cases and academic volumes can only partially convey this resonance. To grasp the full effect, you need to imagine the soundscape: the bleating of sheep, the slap of the potter's wheel, the rhythmic chant of a hymn, merchants haggling in the market, children running across a courtyard. That is the sound of civilization forming itself, layer upon layer, until habits and institutions hardened into recognizable forms of social life. The story of the oldest civilization is also a record of transmission. Libraries collected texts that were copied and recopied for centuries. Scholars preserved knowledge by memorization and through meticulous teaching. The care with which information was passed along ensured that even when political entities dissolved, the methods for accounting and rulemaking could be reactivated and adapted by subsequent polities. When we follow the threads from clay tablets to modern lawbooks, from reed boats to international trade laws, we see continuity prescribed by practical necessity and human creativity. Knowledge is not simply inherited whole, it is always reinterpreted, contested, and reinvented. The earlier innovations provided building blocks that later societies could reconfigure to meet new challenges. This civilization also taught us something about the limits of power. Kings could command armies and build temples, but they could not command the weather or always control the social consequences of their policies. Foresight and humility were sometimes more valuable than brute force, and the surviving texts often reflect leaders who were both brilliant and fallible. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of the first civilization challenges the modern illusion that progress is linear or inevitable. Technologies and institutions can be transformative, yet they require maintenance, ethical attention, and broad public commitment if they are to be sustainable. Looking back at those early cities is not a nostalgic exercise but a meditation on what it takes to build durable social forms. Over time, scholars and enthusiasts rebuilt partial biographies of ancient individuals from lists of names, family trees, and legal contracts. These reconstructions allow us to imagine not just kings and priests but farmers, merchants, artisans, and families whose daily labors wove the social fabric. The past becomes less a monument and more a mirror when we recognize the continuity of human concerns across millennia. Archaeology and history have also revealed the adaptability of culture. Even as languages shifted and empires rose and fell, certain core practices endured: writing, urban planning, rituals marking seasons, and a persistent sense that law and administration matter. Those continuities demonstrate that cultural innovation is a process of accumulation and refinement rather than abrupt invention. To think about the oldest civilization is to witness an early human attempt to manage abundance and scarcity, to create rules around cooperation and competition, and to imagine gods and futures that provided meaning to difficult labor. It is to see how communities become larger than their members and how institutions acquire momentum of their own. The story of those first urban societies is therefore both a tale of achievement and a cautionary parable. So much of what we inherit from that ancient plain survives not in ruins alone but in the rhythms of modern life. Our calendars, our legal terminology, and even the notion of a literate bureaucracy all carry traces of the Mesopotamian experiment. recognizing that lineage connects modern ears to an ancient song, a distant but persistent voice that reminds us why writing, law, and cooperation were so urgently necessary to human survival. And yet the past remains open to reinterpretation. New discoveries continue to rewrite our narratives, showing that what we thought we knew was always provisional. Each tablet unwrapped, each site surveyed, and each technological advance in archaeology peels back another layer, expanding rather than contracting the imaginative space between us and those early inhabitants. The longest lesson from those old river plains is perhaps this: civilization is not a monument but a continuous practice, a set of efforts and choices that require constant care. The earliest cities teach us that infrastructure, law, and culture are not inevitable end states but fragile achievements that demand investment. If we treat them that way, if we take seriously the labor required to maintain them, we may yet learn to steward our shared life with a fraction of the care displayed by those ancient hands pressing symbols into wet clay. There is no final word on the oldest civilization because no final word is ever possible when people keep talking to one another across time. The tablets, the ruins, the myths, and the art remain invitations to keep listening, to keep debating, and to keep learning. As you move through your own day, the legacy of those early builders follows, revealed in rules you obey, in the words you write, in the structures that carry water to your home, and in the stories you tell to make sense of life.